Welcome, everyone. This is Higher Discourse. This is the show where we talk about the infinite positive possibilities of our shared future and what's holding us back. In this episode, I'd like to expand upon this concept of manipulation immunity that I talked about in the previous episode. I want to talk about two major ways we're manipulated, why anyone would even want to manipulate individuals and societies, and what we might gain as a people if we build up that manipulation immunity. We've got a lot to talk about this episode, folks, so hang in there. Let's talk about it. Efforts to make a difference in this world, I think we're manipulated in two major ways. First, we're manipulated against each other. I think that's the first and foremost way we're manipulated. It's the main manipulation we experience. We're manipulated into thinking and believing that we are on one team and belong to one tribe while others belong to the other tribe, the other team. When the truth is that we are all one tribe, one team, and we are dying from a false divide. And the second major manipulation I want to talk about today is the way we're manipulated away from solutions to problems, into thinking the solutions to problems are bad or evil or just simply won't work. Therefore, we shouldn't even try. When the truth is, the solutions we need aren't bad for humankind, they're just bad for economies. And the two are not the same. The solutions that can help people, that save lives, that improve the human condition, and even solutions that free the people from coerced labor. We're trained to focus on how these solutions hurt the money, and we're trained to focus away from and forget how these solutions help humankind, how they help us. I think that's one of the tricks that gets played on us. We get convinced that if we take care of the money, we take care of the people. And that's not true. That never has been true. And because of the way money works, that never will be true. It can never be. But yeah, we'll talk more about that later. For now, I want to talk about the first major manipulation, which is how we're manipulated against each other. We get systematically divided up as people down these sort of tribal lines, and we're kept in a perpetual state of conflict. I think a lot of people believe that the countless conflicts we see in the world are natural, or just the way it is, as they say. I think we become convinced that people are just too different from one another, and those differences are impossible to ignore or overcome. But I would argue that these differences, these divisions, these conflicts we see around the world are in no way natural. Just because something is normal doesn't mean it's natural. You know, I mean, it's normal for people to wear shoes, but it's not natural. I mean, people aren't born wearing shoes. And in that same context, I don't think our divisions are natural divisions. They're all just perceived divisions, imaginary. When it comes to what's normal and what's natural, I think we tend to conflate the two. If something is unnatural, it doesn't mean it can't be normalized. All you need for it to be considered normal is for it to be commonplace, for it to be widespread, and maybe for it to be everywhere all the time. Perhaps even for it to have been around for centuries before you were born. And by the time you're born, everybody is used to it and everybody agrees that it is whatever it is. That makes it normal to you and normal to the people around you, but that doesn't make it natural. And so these divisions, these lines we draw between each other, between peoples, between groups, between tribes of human beings, despite being normal to us, they're not at all natural. They're fictions. human constructs. They're just inventions of the human mind, psychological inventions that we've been convinced are real. And this is one of the major manipulations we need to build up an immunity to. So I'd like to zoom in a bit on this concept of fictions, on this concept of what is real and what is not, right? What is true, actual, and tangible, literally real versus what is not, what's made up, what we construct and invent in our minds and then agree upon as reality. I think there's a difference there. And I think zooming into that difference, putting a little bit of spotlight on that difference could help this conversation. I think it's a hard distinction for a lot of people to make because so many of these fictions we invent and construct become normalized. They become commonplace. They become cultural. And I think that's one of the things that we miss. When I say manipulation, I don't necessarily mean nefarious or malicious intent. Sometimes manipulations are deeply embedded in our lifestyles and day-to-day living, so much so that they become cultural norms. And that culture would have us conform to those norms and would have us adjust our thinking to agree with those social constructs, those fictions. So to illustrate what I mean when I say fiction, let's go on a bit of a thought journey, shall we? I just want to share a brief thought experiment with you. Suppose that you and I are both gods, and we're floating together somewhere above reality. In this thought experiment, you are a god that holds the power of creation itself, while I'm a god with, let's say, a different power. So using your power of creation, you select a planet rich in resources, and on that planet, you create a utopian town. And finally, you create a utopian people to live and prosper in that town. But now it's my turn. I don't possess the power of creation as you do, but let's say I can influence what has already been created. So now that you've gotten things started, I disappear from your side and I reappear standing in the center of your utopian town, surrounded by a great many of your utopian people. At this point, I capture their attention and convince them all to imagine a line down the center of their town. I ask them to join me in believing that there is a line there. Join me in seeing it there, right down the center of the town. I stand there at the center of your utopian town, talking so much and for so long about this line that the people start to believe it's real. After all, who would talk so much and so confidently about something that's not real? After a while, your utopian people all agree that the line they imagine is real. They all agree on this unified imaginary construct, this line down the middle of the town, splitting the town. And now one town has become two. Now, standing on this imaginary line, I ask the people on one side to choose a name for themselves, and they do. And then I ask the people on the other side of the line to do the same, and they do. See, these utopian people you've created are easy for me to manipulate because they're innocent, which means they're gullible, mentally malleable. At this point, I ask just a few simple questions of your utopian people. Now that your people all agree that the line is really there, and they've even named the two different sides, I ask your people, which of their two towns is better? Now your people look at me with confusion on their faces, unsure of what I mean. And so I explain. I say to them, well, good people, I'm just a humble visitor. I'm just a humble visitor seeking the best town, the greatest town to rest my weary head. I must know, good people, which town has the smartest people, Which town has the strongest men and the most beautiful women? Which town has the sweetest fruits to eat and the softest beds for sleep? Which town, good people, is the greatest town? Now, I see in your people's eyes that they're now wondering too. I see that the questions I've introduced to them are now churning away in their minds. And that's when I know my mission is complete. That's when I know I can leave these people and return to your side so we could again look upon your utopian people. So to finalize my exit, I exclaim to your people with sorrow and regret that since they do not know, I cannot stay in either of their towns. Since they cannot answer such questions, I must search for greatness elsewhere. I must move on from their towns and never return. Because clearly neither town is worthy. And in a flash, I disappear from their eyes and reappear next to you, both of us floating just above reality as gods. Now, side by side, we both watch your utopian people. We watch as they snap out of their stupors and begin to live out their lives again. But something critical has changed about them and their behaviors, about the way they think of themselves, about the way they think of each other, and the way they think of their two towns. Now that they see this imaginary line is real and one town has become two, you and I watch as they begin choosing different colors and symbols to represent their town and distinguish it from the other town. We watch as they begin to barricade themselves inside and within each respective town, treating each town like its own fortress. Your people began writing different stories for themselves and keeping different histories, each town developing its own version of reality. They start to teach their children about the greatness of their town and the people within it. They develop cultures that highlight and value the differences between the people of one town over the people of the other town. Before long, each town independently believed that they were the best town, the greatest, most superior town, with the better people living within their town. We watch as they war over resources, as they each believe that their town is the worthy town, worthy of those resources. They raise their children to be educated on the evils committed by the other town during those wars. They highlight the worst things that those people of the other town have ever done, and they teach that those evils are all those other people are. Then those children become adults with hatred for the other town and its evil people. And to support their beliefs, they have centuries of their own history that proves their hatred justified. According to them, there's proof in lifetimes of bloodshed. Even in times of peace, the two towns forbid love or romance between the two peoples. They forbid mingling or commingling, as it's thought to be a loss of greatness, a diminishing or tainting of what's pure. So any young couples that form are quickly denounced, or worse. You and I, as gods, we float above it all, and we watch this subtle harm that I've caused your people. We watch it spread across their numbers like a psychological infection. Just my simple, tiny little influence latched into your people's minds like a virus. And that virus now breeds and spreads as the people do. One town becomes two. Two towns become four. And four towns become 8. And as the people spread their population across the continents of the world you created, there are endless new towns, each one taught that it's the best town with the best people. You and I watch your people together for tens of years, then hundreds, and then thousands of years. As the people develop so many imaginary lines that even they lose count. Before long, the imaginary lines of the towns and territories aren't enough to answer the burning questions I left with your people. Those lines aren't enough to sate the endless hunger I'd left inside of them. So they start to see the imaginary lines in their skin colors, in their religions. They start to see those imaginary lines in their intelligence quotients. They see the imaginary lines in their languages, in their eye shapes, their lip sizes, their so-called heritage. These are people who no longer need me to suggest and convince them of one imaginary line. Now your formerly utopian people are creating their own, countless new imaginary lines of their own, every day, every year, every century. And we watch. See, my work was done on the first day. My mission to destroy your people and their utopia was done on the first and only day I visited your people all those thousands of years ago. All I had to do was convince them of a fictional split between them, convince them that it was real, and then suggest that one side of the split was better than the other, convince them that one side even could be better than the other. And this virus, this contagion, was born in your town, in your people. Now you, as a God of creation, you can't destroy me or anything else. You can only create. So in response to this destructive influence I've introduced to your people, all you can do is create more people. You can help the people multiply and grow in population, but that does not remove my influence. In fact, it only helps my influence spread across generations and continents. Like I said, this psychological virus I implanted in your people's minds spreads as they do. At this point in your godly wisdom, you realize that these people are no longer utopian. These people are no longer yours. You realize that these people, your people, have become mine. And the only hope you have left is that the people will someday overcome my influence on their own and grow in enough wisdom to recognize and remember the utopia they are, the utopia they've always been. You can only hope that the people remember the truth that they've only ever been one town. Now, let's break this down, this thought experiment, and talk this thing out. Once these utopian people imagine a line down the center of that town, it starts a whole mess, doesn't it? It starts a whole cascade of events. Before long, folks start to attach their town identity to their personal identity. And the people who ponder upon the question of which town is the superior town always come to the same conclusion, don't they? Well, my town. My town is the best town, of course. The people from the superior town think it's best to protect their superiority by restricting passage between the towns or mingling with the folks from the so-called inferior town. And what about resources? When the resources are to be allocated or shared by the people, the so-called superior town will become convinced that they deserve the lion's share of those resources, which then leads, of course, to the inevitable resistance from the so-called inferior town, because obviously those people will struggle for the resources they need to survive. Add to that the fact that these are generations and generations of townspeople. You know, people teaching their children what their parents taught them and passing on to new generations the same ideas and concepts that were passed down to them. And so the children inherit the imaginary line that their great-great-grandparents imagined, along with all the meanings and values that each side of the line are alleged to have. And once those children are adults, they also teach their children to believe in the same imaginary line, continuing the cycle without even realizing it's a cycle. It's hard to break a cycle you haven't even noticed you're in, isn't it? See, this whole time, it's really only ever been one town. But that imaginary line that the people drew down the center of the town caused their thinking to shift ever so slightly. And that's all it takes for one town to become two. After that, it's easy for the people to see themselves as two peoples. Fast forward and it becomes about superior people versus inferior people, worthy people versus unworthy people, all because of one imaginary line that all the people agreed was really real in the first place. But it's only ever been one town. So when I say the word fiction, that's what I mean. That imaginary line down the center of that town, a fiction resting deeply and comfortably in our psychology that gives birth to other fictions. We draw that same imaginary line just like that town did. Sure, we draw that imaginary line with human territories, but we also draw that imaginary line with races and ethnicities. We draw it with our politics and ideologies. We draw that imaginary line with our religions and beliefs. We have these imaginary lines all over our societies and cultures, sort of parsing out and dividing up the one town that we are, the one town that we have always been. Now, obviously, to some degree, it's completely natural for the human brain to need to divide and define, sort reality, breaking it up into, more manageable pieces. And I think that's worth mentioning. Just like you can't eat an entire meal in one giant chomp, you have to eat that meal one bite at a time. I think our brains are the same way. I think our brains have to summarize the world around us. On some level, it would be impossible to conceive of everything with no labels or dividing lines, to consume all of reality in that one chomp, so to speak. I think our brains need in some way to chop up that meal of reality into smaller, more consumable bites so we can process it a little easier. I think in and of itself, the brain's tendency to parse up and label and divide reality into manageable chunks isn't so bad on its own. It's not wrong or anything on its own. I just want to be clear about that. The problem is when we start to assign attributes and value and worth to those different labels, superiority and inferiority and things like that. When we start to attach this sort of baggage of meaning to those things from the histories and harms of the past and present, we start to define which of those towns is the better town with the better, more worthy and deserving people. Which of those towns has all the heroes while the other town has all the villains. The problem is when we start to believe that one people can be inherently better and more worthy than the other. And when we become convinced that one country, one ethnicity, one religion or gender is inherently superior to the other. See, in reality, there's only one town with one infinitely complex people within that town. But then we were born into a manipulation that encouraged us to agree that this imaginary line is truly there, that it truly exists. And now we believe in two towns like our parents did. Then we were manipulated into believing that one of those towns is superior to the other. One of those towns is just better. And off we go to war for the sake of our town. We join the debates, we join the arguments, we join the conflicts, and yes, we join the wars for our sacred town. Somewhere between being born and becoming an adult, we were taught to believe in the imaginary line, taught to believe it was real, and then taught what side we were on, what side we belong on. taught that our town is the good town with the better people, and those other guys are that other town with the worse people of less value. It's still one town, and it could only ever be one town. But in the minds of the people who carry this psychological contagion, it can be however many towns they can imagine. It comes down to however many bullshit lines they hold in their heads at once. You know, it makes me think of like a parent who's trying to feed their child a single sandwich, but the child wants 2 sandwiches, you know, and the parent has no intention of feeding the child 2 sandwiches, but the child insists and whines and cries that that's what they want. They want 2 sandwiches. So a clever parent might just cut the 1 sandwich right down the middle and hand the child 2 pieces. And if the child is young enough, inexperienced enough, they'll walk away happy with their 2 sandwiches. But the clever parent knows it's still just 1 sandwich. And the mathematical sort of trickery occurred in the child's mind, in their psychology. The trick works because of the child's perceptions. The child may lack the maturity or perhaps the development to understand that just because the parent cut the sandwich down the middle doesn't suddenly make it 2 sandwiches. It's still only 1 sandwich. No matter how many times you cut it, it will only ever be 1 sandwich. And likewise, no matter how many imaginary lines try to slice us into more and more pieces, we are only one town. And we can only ever be one town. And just like that child, we as a species are too young to see it, too inexperienced and lacking the maturity to see that it's only 1 sandwich. We are only one people, and we are only one town. Now, as I mentioned before, not all manipulations are malicious or intentional. This 1 town, 2 town scenario would be an example of the unintentional ways we manipulate each other into certain beliefs. We take our genuine belief in an imaginary line or fiction and we share it. We share that belief. We convince others within our reach of influence. And despite being imaginary, that fiction subsequently spreads as if it's capital T truth. A traveling stray cat won't know or care when it's crossing over a state line because that line is imaginary. It's a human construct, a fiction. We made it up. The same way a pet dog doesn't care if it's, pet parent or pet owner or whatever is one ethnicity or another, from one country or another. These are lines that only humans bother to imagine, and then we place an imagined value into those differences. These fictions are taught to us, and we teach them to our children, our communities, however far our influence reaches. We teach and share our beliefs in these imaginary lines. But I call it unintentional because at least it's usually sourced in a sincere belief in that imaginary line, a sincere belief that it's real. And it becomes intergenerational and widespread, a sort of cultural contagion. And I think that's why we have to critically think our way through life. It's a much slower process. It's a much more careful process, but I think it's worth it. Because it helps us deconstruct the assumptions we grew up within. Those things were perhaps never even real. They were never true. They were just constructs that we socially built into and baked into our own psychology as a people. Imaginary lines that are just integrated and interwoven so deeply into our way of life that we accept them as plain reality, as maybe even self-evident. And we have to personally go through the trouble of dismantling and seeing beyond those things. That's part of that immunity that I'm talking about. But I think of manipulation like a coin with 2 sides. If this 1 town, 2 town scenario represents the dangers of unintentional cultural manipulation on one side of that coin, then what about the other side of that coin? What about not so innocent, active and intentional manipulation where, folks who hold an advantage of power and influence will purposely lead people into harmful and self-destructive directions? Now, I hear you saying, Rufus, that doesn't make sense. Or why would anyone even want to manipulate anyone else? Why would someone who is power advantaged even care to manipulate people who are power disadvantaged, within a society, within a town? What would be the incentive? See, that's the thing. Once you get to this level of deep fiction, deep, pervasive, culturally shared fictions, once you get to this level, that fiction becomes a tool. It becomes an item that can be used and commodified. That division between peoples becomes an economy. And if we're going to talk about incentives within economies, then we need to talk about zero-sum games. Now, eventually I plan to make videos talking about zero-sum games in detail and the general dangers we face as a species when we use zero-sum games on a societal scale. But for now, I'll do my best to give somewhat of a brief explanation of what they are for those who don't know, and a rough summary of the problem. So for those who don't know, a zero-sum game is a competitive game structure where the total points available to the players are fixed. To say it differently, whatever points that will ever be available to the players are already at play among the players at the start of the game. Okay. So let's say, for example, that you and I are sitting down to a friendly zero-sum game worth 10 points. And since this is a friendly game, let's say that we start with 5 points each. Okay. Now, let's say you play well and you do something that earns you plus 1 point. Now you have 6 points. Good for you. But remember, this is a zero-sum game, and this game is only worth 10 points total, and that can't be changed. So by the same action that you gained plus 1 point, well, that same action you made also lost me 1 point. Okay. So plus 1 for you is also -1 for me. So in this 10-point zero-sum game we're playing together, your 6 points means my 4 points. Your 7 points means my 3 points, and so on. Okay. All of the points of a zero-sum game are already in play at the beginning of that game and will remain the same throughout the game. So if either of us wants to earn points, the only place we can get those points is from each other. And eventually, because we're playing a zero-sum game, one of us will have all 10 points and the other will have 0, and that ends the game. This is the basic game logic of a zero-sum game, the basic way they function. The game forces the movement of points to one player from the other player. Okay. It's a game mechanic that forces a conclusion. It forces an end. Zero-sum games aren't designed to be deadlocked and unmoving. In order for the game to progress forward to its end, someone has to lose points to fuel that forward movement of the game. I hope that makes sense. But we're missing a piece of the formula, aren't we? On the surface, a zero-sum game doesn't seem to be all that threatening, I think. Zero-sum games obviously make for a highly competitive game, but by itself, it shouldn't be the absolute end of the world, right? Well, I'll tell you the missing piece of the puzzle right now. What if in a zero-sum game, as you gained points, you also gained power at the same time? What if for every point you gained in the game, you also had more control of the game and its rules? This is connected to what I was trying to say in episode 2 of this podcast about what I call structural corruption. If gaining points in a zero-sum game not only took you closer to winning the game, but also granted you power, authority, and control over the game, what happens then? So, for example, in that 10-point game where you and I both start with 5 points, once one of us achieves the 6th point, knocking the other player down to 4 points, well, it's that 6th point that earns the power to rewrite and control the rules of the game. Then whichever one of us gets the 6 points first, we're going to use that new power and authority that comes with it to shift the game so we can win the game. Yeah, maybe on paper it's having all 10 points that ultimately wins the game. But in reality, if getting the 6th point grants the power, authority, and control to change the game and its rules, then in reality, it's the 6th point that wins the game. Whoever gains that advantage can mold the game to guarantee their victory. I think we have a system that does this same thing. We're not only playing a game of points. The points in our game come with power, the power to shift the game rules. And we use those points and that power to reshape and rewrite the game even as we play it. We have a system where power, authority, and control come prepackaged with the 6th point, and the rest is history. The powerful get more powerful, the weak get weaker. And maybe you ask, well, what about the rules that govern the behavior of the powerful? Well, you guessed it. Those rules are written by the powerful. So how does this zero-sum logic connect over to the reason why there would be this incentive for winners to manipulate the losers? And in a zero-sum game where we are sharing the points of this world, why would someone losing at the game need to build up an immunity to manipulation? Well, because the nature of a zero-sum game means that the points others gain are the points you lose. And if more points for the winners also means that they are shifting the rules of the game around, are they going to shift the rules to give themselves less points, or are they going to give themselves more? In a zero-sum game, would the winners really want you to have more points in the game, or would they want you to have less? Would they craft rules that make it easier for you to gain points or harder? Understand, the more points you gain in this game, those points give you politicians in your pocket. Those points give you policies that are good for you written into law, and laws bad for you taken off the books or edited to be impotent laws, neutered. Those points you gain in this zero-sum game gives you media, news media, social media outlets to push your worldview to millions or even billions at a time. Those points you gain give you influence and editing rights over the game, even editing rights over the cultures of the players. So let's follow this train of thought a little more and talk about the natural consequences of this logic, this flawed logic of winning at a game and being rewarded with more ability to win because you're winning. This flawed logic of acquiring more points in a zero-sum game and being rewarded with more power, control, and authority over the same game you're winning at. So recently I was re-listening to one of my favorite audiobooks. It's called Cradle. The Cradle series. It's a 12-book fantasy series by an author named Will White. And in book 1, there's this quick metaphor in there that I really appreciated. This single sentence, one-off metaphor that could easily be overlooked if you're not careful. But I'd like to shine a light on it and maybe hold a magnifying glass to it. Because I think it makes a great starting point for what we need to talk about. For context, without spoiling anything in the books, there were 2 characters locked into this deadly battle, fighting each other for their own reasons. But unbeknownst to either of these 2 characters, these 2 fighters, there was a third character hiding out nearby. Now, this third character was a bit of a villain who had something to gain if either of the first two fighters lost the battle. So if either character lost the battle or if both characters killed each other, this third character hiding out would benefit in either case, no matter the outcome of the fight. Now, the line from the book that describes this hiding villainous third character says, quote, "He was the vulture waiting for the wolf and the tiger to kill each other so it could feed on both corpses," end quote. Now, I'd like to expand on this idea so that we could truly spend a bit more time considering the mindset of a vulture in this type of scenario. But instead of a wolf and a tiger, let's just say a lion and a hyena for our own little thought experiment here, okay? What would a vulture think as it flew overhead while a lion and a hyena fought? I think it's relevant to what I'm trying to say here. What would the vulture want? Would the vulture want to stop that fight, or would he want them to die? Or perhaps both of them to die, which would mean more food for him. See, the vulture in that situation would have a completely different incentive than the lion or the hyena. The vulture would desire an entirely different outcome than them. The vulture, from its position, feeds off of the fight and would feed off of a deadly conclusion to that fight, right? And so you might say, Rufus, what's wrong with that? Well, that's the nature of vultures. That's how they eat and survive. What's the problem? Well, dear listener, the problem is we've got to add that missing piece of the formula we talked about earlier, don't we? It's not just a zero-sum game of life and death where one creature has to die for the other to live. It's more than that. What happens when we package and bundle an increase in power, authority, and control with every victory, or in the case of this vulture, with every feast? Let's play out this thought experiment, shall we? So the lion and the hyena fight, and one dies, which means the vulture eats. With that feast, the vulture powers up. It gains power, authority, control. Let's say that with this new power, it can now influence lions and hyenas. Would the vulture waste its newfound power of influence and just leave lions and hyenas alone? Or would it use that new influence to provoke another fight between two more of them? That would, of course, give it the best chance at securing its own survival, securing its next meal. So what would the vulture do? Well, the vulture is motivated by its own survival, of course, like all of us. So like any living creature trying to give itself the best chances of survival, it uses that influence to provoke another fight. This leads to the vulture's next meal. So now, thanks to the vulture's influence, another lion and another hyena fight, and one of them dies. So the vulture feasts again. Remember, this system the vulture is in is like our own system. So every time the vulture gains a victory or a feast, he gains in power. So as the vulture feeds on its second meal, it powers up again. Now it has more power, more authority, more control. Now the vulture draws up and edits the rules that govern how fights between lions and hyenas are required to play out. And again, like any living creature motivated by its own survival, the vulture uses its new power to declare that all fights between lions and hyenas must be fights to the death, no exceptions. See, now the vulture gets to eat every day. Now the vulture forgets what hunger even feels like. Now the vulture's power, authority, and control are growing more and more every day with every feast. You might say the vulture's power is compounding. See, before long, the vulture might have children to feed. and grandchildren to feed. But it's okay because the vulture has accrued so much power that there are plenty of fighting lions and hyenas dying to feed the vulture's ever-growing family, no matter how big that family gets, right? See, eventually the vulture's family grows and spreads and becomes a dynasty, and that dynasty becomes an empire. And just as that vulture grows an empire, the thing that feeds that growth has to grow as well. So those small fights between one lion and one hyena to the death had to become big fights between the lion tribe and the hyena tribe. As the vulture's empire grew, the fight between tribes had to grow into a war between tribes. You see what I'm saying? Like I said, if the vulture's empire is to grow, what feeds it has to grow as well. So if one vulture feeds off of one death, then an empire of vultures requires endless wars that bring endless deaths. This way, all the vultures within that empire are fed well. And now comes the question of the century. Does this vulture truly want peace between the lion tribe and the hyena tribe? Could any honest vulture even claim to want peace, even as that vulture feeds off the corpses? Right? Like if a vulture is sitting over one of these lion bodies, its beak still wet and red from lion blood, mouth full of lion guts, so the speech is a little muffled as the vulture tries to tell you that he really wants peace between the two tribes. Would you believe him? In truth, this vulture has to make sure there's always war between the lion tribe and the hyena tribe. The vulture's survival and the survival of his empire require it. See, by the vulture's logic, he figures that so long as the lion tribe and hyena tribe stay at eternal war, then the vulture's power and empire can infinitely grow. But in this little thought experiment, what comes next? Well, over time, the vulture starts to notice the population of the lions and hyenas starting to dwindle. All that war and death is devastating to their numbers, of course, but it's okay, see, because the vulture has enough power, control, and authority to correct such a minor issue. As this vulture's empire expands, now all of vulture kind has become more and more dependent on this food supply and the continued conflicts between the two tribes. But because the food supply is dwindling, the vulture takes what seems to be the next logical step to ensure the continued survival of vulture kind, of his empire. So what's the next logical step, you ask, for the vulture when he sees a dwindling food supply? Well, he'll do what anybody does. You control that supply. You remove that food supply from the wild, you domesticate it, and you make it go from unpredictable to predictable. More and more control is one of the powers he gains every time he eats. So why would he waste it? So the vulture decides to cage the lion tribe and then separately cage the hyena tribe to farm them. He starts to grow them and breed them within these cages, only releasing them from their respective cages in controlled numbers at a controlled pace to serve up more death and bloodshed. Why wouldn't he? The vulture just wants to eat. He not only wants to eat, he wants security. The vulture wants to be able to eat forever. He wants to be able to feed his children and their children forever, his empire forever. And so he breeds all the hyenas in one cage and breeds all the lions in another, letting each of them out only for fighting, and always a fight to the death, always. What vulture wouldn't do that if they had the power, control, and authority to do it? Because it's all about survival, right? And if you put a whole lot of control and authority and power in the hands of somebody trying to survive, they're going to use that power to do just that, survive. And on this will go until this behavior eventually leads to extinction. Now, why do I say extinction? I'll get to that in a bit. For now, let's critically think about this vulture and its desperate desire for survival. If that vulture exists within a system that grants him more and more power with each victory, each feast, and if that vulture rose to a level of power where it could either stop a war or start one, which would it choose? If a war started and served up feast after feast for the vulture and his family, would the vulture want to stop that endless war? Or is it a necessary requirement for the vulture's empire? Now, this vulture has an empire built off of war and death, and only the vulture's children can live in peace, even if it's a false peace. But at the heart of all this suffering is just a vulture and its most basic concerns for survival. But the vulture just happened to be in a zero-sum system that also granted more power with every victory. This is what makes a zero-sum game the most dangerous kind of game when it does this. It changes the game between us all, from not just being a battle for the points in that game, but also a battle for the power that comes with those points. And something else we should consider. In the real world, we're not even playing fair, are we? To be clear, the game itself is corrupt. Just structurally speaking, the game is built to be corrupt at its best. But on top of that, we're not even playing this corrupt game fairly. We didn't start this zero-sum game with an even scoreboard, 5 points for you and 5 points for me, a meal for you and a meal for me. No. We started this game with different points already pre-existing in our bank accounts, in our parents' bank accounts, in our grandparents' bank accounts. We started with different regions of the planet to work with, different resources that were available to us. We started with different countries and different powers and strengths in those countries, each country at its own different stage of empire, let's say of vulturism. This zero-sum game we're playing does not start us off with the same points. Some folks start with way more points. Some folks, some groups, some institutions, some countries. And pre-packaged with those points comes more power, more authority, more control. And of course, those who hold the most get to write and rewrite and edit the rules of the game within which they are also players. Do you see the problem? See, not only are zero-sum games problematic in their own right when we put people's lives on the line as collateral in those games, but the way we also bundle power and control and authority in with those points, in with the point system, is a recipe for extinction. It's a disastrous formula that literally can't be overstated. So the reason I say it leads to extinction is because if you think about it like that vulture, he will always need more food for his ever-growing empire. But since he's trying to infinitely grow within a zero-sum game, those points that the vulture wants have to come from somewhere, which means he will always need more and more lions and hyenas to fight and die to keep earning his points. New points will require new death. More points will require more death. And the vulture is simply too short-sighted and lacking in wisdom to see the inevitable breaking point of his plan. How big can those cages get for the lions and the hyenas before it gets too hard to control them? And the vulture's, staff is stretched too thin to keep them all in check. Can the lions and the hyenas' birth rates keep up with the consumption rates of the vultures and the growing family, the dynasty, the empire, ever more hungry? right? And then it takes more energy and time to make a new life than it does to kill it. So how old should the vulture let the lion babies and the hyena babies get before they're sent into battle to die and be eaten? Wait too long for them to age and the vultures of the empire go hungry. Fail to wait long enough and the farm's population starts to dwindle again. Too much too soon. Right? What's the balance? And what are the lions and hyenas eating this whole time? Stuck in those cages being farmed. They need steadily growing food supply as well. What about sickness and disease? If any of them die without being eaten by the vultures, not to mention they're stuck in those enclosed spaces, what should the vulture do about festering diseases? Right? As the zero-sum game tries to expand, the vulture will start to constantly see new emerging problems, making it harder to continue. See, a zero-sum game exists between like two impenetrable walls. Like one of those, like one of those pit traps from the older movies, where the hero is trapped in a room and these two opposite walls on opposite sides of the room are, spiked and slowly closing in on the hero character, threatening to kill him. Zero-sum games are trapped like that between two spiked walls of inescapable facts. Right. So like one of those spiked walls is the fact that zero-sum games aren't capable of sitting still with the points unmoving. OK, the game is forced into motion. All zero-sum games are forced into motion and the points are forced to flow. Right. And on the other spiked wall in that same room, you have the unavoidable fact that the points are not infinite. They're finite points. OK. And so eventually in a zero-sum game, the points run out. They get expended. So eventually these two spiked walls collapse in on the zero-sum game and forces it to come to an end. All right. These two things are inescapable with zero-sum games. Again, no matter the zero-sum game, neither of these two things can be escaped. It's not like the hero from the movies that can eventually escape at the last minute. All zero-sum games come with these two spiked walls, forcing them to end. They always force a conclusion, ultimately. So all zero-sum games end up being on like this unseen timer before they conclude. The question is, depending on the zero-sum game, depending on the resources and the points available, how much time is left on that timer? But with zero-sum games, that timer is always ticking. The clock's always running out. So this thing that the vulture is doing has a breaking point. The whole thing is built on a zero-sum formula that will always require losses in order to progress forward with the gains. In fact, a constant and steady stream of losses for the game to progress forward. And that means when the losses are running out, then the winning is also running out. And the whole thing starts to destabilize. Once the bottom of a system falls out, the top falls out too. First, the lions go extinct, then the hyenas, and then the vultures go extinct as well. That's why I say extinction. Everyone's lives were on the line with this game, and so it leads to extinction for all. Now, to be clear, ever since this vulture's first meal at the beginning of his growth, before he built an empire, it was always headed in this direction of ending. Even before it got to the point where it was obviously collapsing, it was still collapsing. Even though it didn't seem like it to the vulture, his empire was technically collapsing even as it was first beginning to grow. Because it was the vulture's formula that had the collapse built into it at its very beginning. The game the vulture was playing at was a zero-sum game, and all zero-sum games end. The winning is created from the losing. It's just a question of how many losses the game can handle before it ends. So calling back to that 10-point game that I described earlier, the maximum losses possible before the game ends is 10 points, isn't it? Once one player in an effort to survive is holding all 10 points, that means the other player is holding 0 and the game collapses. It ends. And the vulture in this scenario is following the same zero-sum formula. Eventually, the resources are depleted to 0 and the vulture's empire ends. Eventually, the breaking point is reached. The maximum winning occurs and the maximum losing occurs, and the vulture's game can't replenish itself fast enough to support itself. The game ends. The vulture's entire system collapses. The formula forces a conclusion, even if the vulture couldn't see it. The vulture was distracted by its own survival, of course, and blinded by its successes and growth along the way, but it was using the wrong formula the entire time. And we do the same shit. We are just as blind as that vulture with the zero-sum game we play. Whether we're talking about individuals or we're talking about empires, either way, it's still people motivated by survival, motivated by winning, and we're blind to the flaw in the formula. We're out here just trying to survive. We get our points in the game and we use the power that comes bundled with those points to survive, to either protect what points we have or score more points in the game, all of it to survive. It's all just survival reasoning, but it's locked within a zero-sum game that trades in power and control. Like if somebody was a slave master who owned a plantation, would they preach to the slaves that slavery is wrong? Or would they tell their slaves that slavery is the proper way of the world? You know, when all the lawmakers of a city are also slave masters themselves, are they going to make laws that relinquish power and free the slaves? Probably not. Especially if their prestigious position as lawmakers comes from the fact that their plantations are performing so well and enriching them so much. You know, maybe that's how they got their seats as lawmakers. Are they going to make laws that end all of that winning they're experiencing? New laws that free all the slaves and just instantly remove all that labor from the plantation? No. As a slave master and a lawmaker who is winning the game and gaining more power and control from that winning, their behavior is predictable. That's what I'm trying to say. They're going to serve and preserve their power by writing laws that keep them in power and keep the slaves enslaved. What if slavery somehow ends in this scenario of a slave master, right? And all of the former slaves are free to leave the plantation and go live in the city. But wait a minute. What if the slave master, the former slave master in this scenario, still appoints the mayor of that city? Maybe after a while, the people finally protest and fight for their right to vote for their mayor, but the former slave master is still the one who counts the votes. Maybe the people finally get the right to count their own votes. But by law, the former slave master still holds the primary electoral vote that has the power to override the popular vote. Maybe he does this by the law, but it's a law he wrote. Not to mention, the city's entire economy in this scenario is built on the cotton those former slaves were once picking. Are they going to be allowed to grow their own cotton now and be truly free to do what they want when they want? Or are they still going to have to show up at the plantation once per day, clocking in to their former plantation, which has been converted now to cotton factories and cotton warehouses, still owned by the former slave master and his family? Oh, sure, the people are free, according to popular opinion. They just happen to starve and die if they fail to show up at the the workplace. Work. If they fail to show up to their jobs, they just happen to still starve and die if they don't show up to work. See, a couple of clever name changes and people can completely miss the fact that the formula hasn't changed. In this slave scenario, are those former slaves able to freely acquire the resources they need to survive? Or do they still need to submit somewhere and trade their bodies and their time to get those resources? Is this former slave master really working with a different reasoning than when he owned the slaves and had them working on his plantation? Or is he still fundamentally using the same reasoning to preserve his own power and control, to preserve his points in the game? See, this is the kind of shit we need to be careful of, you know, because we are generations and generations deep in that city. I'm talking about grandmothers and grandfathers, great-great-grandmothers and great-great-grandfathers. I'm saying it was our great-great-great-grandparents who were the original slaves on that plantation. And now we are born, and our parents were born into a system that told them that they were free. Born into that slave master's city where he still runs the show and told that everything's fine. Even as it crumbles to pieces and burns down, everything's fine. And we're told that this is the way the world is supposed to be. More and more work, more and more struggle, endless struggling with bills, endless struggling with debt, just to get access to resources we need to live, spending more and more time at work. But it's the right thing to do, they say. It's what the good guys do. They clock in and go to work. They hustle, they grind, endless grind. It just so happens that if you don't show up to work, you starve and die. That's just how the world works. We're told that it's the proper way for everything to function, where all the resources we need to live are locked behind a paywall, and we have to trade our bodies and our time to someone else if we want them to let us borrow access to our own survival. You know, here we are upset about, you know, this new economic boom of subscription model services. Everything costs a subscription. Everything you want to do, everything you want to experience, they ask you to sign up monthly and pay monthly for it instead of just letting you buy it once. And we're upset about that, having to constantly pay monthly for something that should be paid for once or should be free. Meanwhile, we don't even notice that our own survival has been locked behind a subscription model, locked behind a paywall, and we're forced to subscribe so we could borrow access to our next day, to our next month, to our next year, forced to subscribe to our own survival for just a small monthly fee of our entire lives. We were born into a system where we're not allowed to simply own our own survival. Someone else owns the water, the food, the shelter, all the resources people need for survival. Someone else has power over, control over, and authority over those resources. And so you and me, we have to show up to the plantation. We got to clock in at work. We have to stay subscribed for monthly access to our own survival. And if you fail to show up, if you quit, you just happen to starve and die. That's the way the world is. It's the way the world is supposed to work, right? But no, trust me, bro, you're not a slave. Slavery ended. See, we wrote it down right here. You could look at this piece of paper and it proves that slavery is over. Now get your ass to work. Trust me, we're all free. See, now we're so free, we get to choose our plantation and choose our master. But is that freedom? And maybe we tell ourselves that we're so free that we can become our own master. Maybe we can go out and buy up the stocks and own the businesses and companies and own the real estate investment properties. And then we could be free, right? Well, sure, in exchange for owning other people. In exchange for letting them go run around doing the work, clocking in on the plantation, picking the cotton. Sure, you can be free. If you want to call that freedom, a freedom that comes at the costs of others and their freedom, sounds an awful lot like a zero-sum game. A trade from your points to my points. A trade from your value to my value. And then I could be, quote unquote, free. All you have to do is sell out and sell your soul and become a master on that plantation. Rather than getting rid of the plantation, just become a master on that plantation, and then you too can be free. And once you become a master and once you own your own plantation, you own the labors of the free people you have chained up on that plantation. Surely that's the freest freedom there is, right? It's bullshit. And we don't seem to have figured that out yet. We're born into a world with corrupt games that only leave us with corrupt options for our own survival. And then we're told by the most powerful people that are winning the game that this is the only way the world could possibly be, the only way it could possibly function or work. You could either be a slave or a slave owner. Oh, right. I forgot. We're supposed to, we're free. I'm supposed to use the new language for these words. You could either be a worker, just working your whole life, or you can own companies, businesses, and real estate to gain financial freedom. Got to make sure I use the current words for these things. But no matter how we word it, our current system only gives us two options if we want to survive. We could either sell our bodies and our time to someone who owns the resources we need to survive, or we could sell our souls to the devil and own those resources ourselves so that others need what we have. And they'll work for us so that we don't have to. It's a dark trade and a dark deal. And a lot of us take it. A lot of us sign on the dotted line and we sell our soul and we take that deal. I say it's selling our soul to the devil because essentially you're sparing yourself the anguish of work and struggle by using other people's anguish and struggle in exchange. That's what I mean by dark trade. It's a foul and dirty thing to do, but it's what we're left with as an option. You could either be a slave or a slave owner. There's only two positions available in this game that we've set up for ourselves on this planet, right? It's like not wanting to give up an organ yourself, so you cut it out of someone else to spare yourself. You sacrifice others to save yourself. And we have a system that we don't even question why it demands our organs in the first place. We just are born into this world and we follow suit and we run and find other people's organs to cut out because we want to spare ourselves. We never stop to ask ourselves, why the hell do we have a system that's trying to kill us in the first place? And so all of us run around scrambling, fighting for resources. That's what it means to own resources and sacrifice others to slavery to spare yourself. If you hate work enough, you could go and own real estate properties, right? I remember being young and like every time you turn on the television after a certain hour of the day, there's just a million infomercials on, owning real estate, buying real estate, becoming a real estate investor. You know what I mean? Get rich, gain financial freedom. But let's think about that, right? When you own 50 properties, 50 real estate investments, as they say, that's just the nice way of saying you own 50 families. You own the 50 families toiling away day in and day out at jobs they hate. And most of that money is coming to you. And a lot of people hate on real estate investing, real estate investors. A lot of people hate on landlords, right? But I think that the reason they hate on landlords so much is because it's just the most apparent fraud. It's just the most apparent way to see the genuine corruption that we are subjected to. The idea that, you can own so much more than you need, and it's houses we're talking about. So in this case, 50 houses, and you really only need one. And you use that ownership to let 50 families inside those houses run around toiling away, struggling, picking that cotton, and bringing the spoils home to you. You, of course, sitting back with your money, counting all the dollars. You see what I'm saying? And I think that we are so easily angered by that because it's very blatant and apparent to see. It's a very simple way to look at the corruption in the formula. But we don't realize that everything in our economy works that way. All of our economy works that way. You can't mention one stock investment, one job, one anything, economically speaking, that does not work and function the same way, just with a few more added steps. Looking at landlords and getting upset is only because you're looking at a distilled concentration of the very same formula that is the makeup of our entire global economy. Someone somewhere has to lose and sacrifice themselves on the plantation, struggling to survive, while someone else owns and holds the resources they need to survive. And that's why that person toils, because they need a little bit of access to that survival. They need to borrow that survival so they can have just one more day of food, one more week of food, one more month of shelter. That's the way the entire fucking economy works. But we fixate on this one little fragment of this corruption and we get really upset. It's like looking at a giant pile of shit and you're mad at that one little piece of corn inside the shit. So anyway, now you have these 50 families toiling away, working jobs they hate. They come home, they pay you most of that money. And so when we say, oh, you own 50 properties of real estate, it's just a nice way of saying you own 50 families. We just don't like those words anymore. We don't want to use the ugly ways of admitting the truth. OK, so we launder a lot of our words. We prefer the laundered versions of the story of what we're doing as a society, as a people, as a species. And so we have to ask ourselves, is slavery over or do we just call it something else? Has it always been there in the formula before and after what we call chattel slavery? This is in the formula, the corruption. And let's say you are a big proponent of this sort of false freedom and you tell yourself, well, those 50 families could be free if they really wanted to, if they wanted to work hard enough and, own that property instead of paying a landlord. Well, guess what? Now they still pay the banks, which is the same formula. They have to pay someone else for access to their own survival. OK, it's still the same formula. And this is what I mean. It's a false choice when you could choose between two masters. Choose between the white whip and the black whip and the brown whip. They both tear the skin all the same when they whip you in the back. Maybe you want the red whip today or the blue whip, and you want to tell yourself you have the freedom of choice because you could choose your own master. And you could choose which plantation has the prettiest grass and the nicest trees, the prettiest smelling flowers. Or maybe you tell yourself that, if one or more of these 50 families, really wants their own freedom and they don't want the banks ruling them, then surely they could just become landlords themselves, own another 50 houses, own another 50 families. And we have to ask ourselves, how far can that formula go before it reaches its breaking point? Can every family own 50 families? Can everyone be a landlord? Can everyone own stock and have all those numbers go up at once? No. Because we're not wanting to admit it to ourselves, but it's a zero-sum game. Someone has to lose in order for someone to win. And so we create those losers in order to create those winners. It's the formula. So whatever we want to call that formula, it's the same formula. These are, in essence, the two options our system leaves us with. Your survival is locked behind a paywall, and that paywall is not even questioned. And you're given the freedom to choose who to sell your soul to in exchange for a subscription to your survival. Why are we then so shocked that the people who choose to sell their soul to survive turn out to behave like selfish, greedy villains? We're shocked when they make horrible, selfish, greedy choices that fuck everybody else over. Why are we so shocked? When the only choice the current game gives us is to either be a villain or be a victim. So you say, now come on, Rufus, that's just what bad guys do. The good guys wouldn't do the wrong things if they were in control. Only villains are corrupt and greedy for power no matter what it does to other people. Yeah, maybe not. Let's take you, for example. If you were making $2 million a year as some sort of upper manager in a company somewhere, but let's say you get word from the boss right above you in the hierarchy that your company needs to cut $1 million from the annual payroll before the new fiscal year. Okay. Are you going to take the bullet for the team? Are you going to take that bullet for the team and cut your 2 million income down to 1 million? And bada bing, bada boom, that's, the company did it. You guys saved $1 million off of payroll annually. And now your 1 million a year, should be plenty to survive on, but you had to just give up the other million you were making. You had to give yourself a pay cut by half. Are you going to use your power, this power and authority you have in your position as an upper manager in this company? Are you going to use your power to cut that money from your own paycheck, take your 2 million down to 1, or are you going to lay people off? Are you going to lay off enough people until it adds up to be $1 million, right? Let's say like 20 people, 20 of the subordinates beneath you who are making 50 grand a piece. Are you going to cut them and lay them off? Or are you going to take that hit for the team and give yourself a pay cut? Which do you choose? If we're being honest, most people would choose their own survival. Not just any chance for survival, but the best chance, the greatest chance for survival. Yeah, $1 million a year sounds like plenty to us financially impaired folks down here at the bottom of this economic hierarchy we're living in. But if you literally had the choice between 2 million in one hand and 1 million in the other hand, most people are going to take the highest number because in our current system, that's what gives you the highest chances of survival. So no, $1 million isn't going to seem like enough when you already make $2 million, and that's giving you the best chances of survival. Right. It's no different from, someone dying of thirst as they sort of travel across a hot desert. If you gave them the choice between a single cup of water or 2 gallons of water on their journey that they could carry in a backpack, they're going to choose the 2 gallons. Why? Because no, they can't drink it all at once, but those 2 gallons gives them the best chances for survival. No one knows what tomorrow will bring. And so in that same way, the same logic is going to be in your head when you're looking at $2 million a year that you make. Maybe you've been making it for 3, 4, 5 years already. You're not going to take a $1 million pay cut to save this company money when you have the power to lay off 20 subordinates making $50,000 apiece. And you know what else? When the company comes along and they say, thank you for giving us this $1 million payroll cut, we really needed that. Here's a $300,000 bonus. You're going to take that too. Okay. I'm not trying to justify that kind of behavior. I'm trying to explain it. I'm trying to zoom in on the logic that comes from the formula we're all using for our own survival within a zero-sum game. It's all the same reasoning. It's all the same logic. So like if we go back to that landlord analogy, right? If you own those 50 properties, right? If you own those 50 rentals, are you going to want to see rental prices take a steep drop? Are you going to want to see rent control? Even if it provides relief for struggling renters and all of these people out here, subscribing to their own survival, are you going to want to see things that make things easy for them? Are you going to want to see laws that make things easier for them or you? Because see, in a zero-sum game, the points can only move in one real direction. And as that landlord, you'd be winning at the game of resources, labor, and income at the expense of the ones losing beneath you in the economic hierarchy. So you're not going to want to see things that help them because that is what hurts you. You're going to want things that help you, regardless of the fact that in a zero-sum game, that also means it's going to hurt others. That's the situation this system puts us in. Okay, it's a zero-sum game of survival. And we chose it. We choose it to be this. It's a zero-sum system, and our survival is locked behind a paywall we don't even question. So in this corrupt game, one player's survival comes at the expense of another player. That's why you're not gonna have relief for renters and richer landlords at the same time. It's a zero-sum game. It's why you can't have excellent worker pay and record-setting profits at the same time across all companies. It's why you can't truly solve massive worldwide problems and have booming industries and economies at the same time. I hope you're hearing me. This is a zero-sum game. It won't allow for happy slaves and happy slave masters at the same time. This system forces the creation of losing in order to create the proportionate winning. It's a zero-sum logic at the heart of this system. It's why the whole world can't win and prosper at the same time. The losing is a necessary part of this dark formula we're about as a species. We struggle upward for our victories and our survival, and even as our winning causes the losing of everything and everyone else, we convince ourselves that that's just the way it is, so we can sleep at night. I think that's how this zero-sum game we play keeps us so distracted, even as it hurls us towards its ending, towards extinction. The game keeps us all so focused on our own survival with every single choice we make that we can't see where all those little choices combined as a species are taking us as a species. It's like being so zoomed in on like the tiny cells of something that you can't step back far enough to see the one creature that those cells make up, the one thing that those cells comprise. And I think our choices are like that, you know? Our trillions and trillions of choices worldwide are like the tiny cells of a creature we're too small to see. And because we're within a zero-sum game that has each of us struggling for our own survival, our trillions of choices end up being one single creature of extinction instead of something better. We get raised to believe in and even worship the game as if it's some holy rite of passage, some proving ground to separate the strong from the weak, the worthy from the unworthy. And then surely it'll take us all into some new divine era of prosperity and plenty. You know, once the worthy are properly separated from those unworthies, you know. But it's just manipulation. It's a manipulation that comes from a culture that we were born into, a way of thinking that was taught to us by others, who were taught to think that way by others. We're trained to believe that the game is righteous and fair, and that the only reason people lose is because they deserved it. We're manipulated into denying what this game really is that we're playing here, and that the game demands that losers keep being created in order for winners to continue being created. Let me put this simply. This zero-sum game is an evil game that we play. One that requires blood sacrifices to be made at its altar. It wants humanity to offer up the suffering of some in exchange for the prosperity of others. We have to offer it the slavery of some in exchange for the freedom of others. War for some to get peace for others. But I think that the real devil, the real evil, is in the transaction itself. This take in order to get structure that it uses. And it might be reality within the game, but the game itself is false. We have to be careful what it means when there is a massive power imbalance within a zero-sum game, and the types of influence that that power will have over millions and sometimes billions of people. And before we know it, we think of these things as cultural norms. Or even worse, we see global norms and we get convinced that it's just human nature. This idea of zero-sum transactions being the only way humans can function in this world, it isn't real. It's just a lie that we've been taught is the truth. And it's the victims of this lie, the folks who get manipulated into worshiping this game, that are usually the last ones to spot that evil, the devil in the transaction itself. The folks that worship this evil game are usually the same folks that hate the homeless, the starving, the sick, the losers of the game. In their worship of this evil game, they end up hating the weak, the helpless, the different, the losers of the game, right? When we get taught to worship the game and worship the zero-sum nature of it, we even end up worshiping the devastation and the bloodshed of war because of our hatred of the losers. Like I said, man, that altar needs blood sacrifice, constant blood sacrifices, or the blessings stop. And in a zero-sum game, to worship the gaining of 10 points on one side is the same worship as losing 10 points from the other side. It's the same action that gains a point for one player that loses a point for another. It's the same action. So it's the same worship. And it's in this way that this game has us convinced that we are worshiping life, even as we actually worship death. It has us all fooled into believing we stand for one thing, even as we serve another. We think we worship peace, even as we serve war. We think we worship prosperity as our actions serve suffering. We think we worship concepts like freedom, when really we worship and serve employment, sweet, righteous employment, hard work, that thing that good people do. We're living within a contradiction between the inward humanity within us and the outward inhumanity that the system demands of us. That blood sacrifice at the altar I mentioned. And to deal with that dissonance between what we believe within our hearts and what we actually do with our actions, we make rules and laws and policies to control our actions. Within our culture, we try to cover and patch over this fucked up game and its required blood sacrifices with our pretty rules and regulations and our very nice, very laundered words. I think it's a kind of mass cultural denial, as if this game could work out for everyone if they just follow the rules and go with the flow, maybe prove themselves to be worthy of winning. Like the only failures are happening because of, poor choices. Never mind the mechanics and the formula of the game itself. It's just poor choices. Like the only animals on a farm that get killed and eaten are the ones who messed up somehow. So just don't mess up, animals, and there's nothing to question. Just follow the rules. Don't mess up. Perform well, and you'll be fine. We'll all be fine if we just don't mess up or break the rules. Stay on the farm. And it's just those bad animals that got eaten. Actually, it's the good ones. See, the truth is that the rules are only there to control the losers, like gates on that farm. You can't have a functional farm without strong gates. And where on earth do those gates come from? Who built them? Who maintains them? Within our zero-sum society, we make the winners of this game the ones who make the rules, control the rules, and edit the rules. The ones who enforce the rules, even. Just like I was trying to say in episode 2 of this podcast, we've made the winners of this game the only people with the authority to referee and officiate the game. It's ridiculous that we've done this, but why wouldn't that power then be used to manipulate the game's outcome? So from that vulture's perspective, for example, anytime that vulture overhears the lions talking of peace and wanting to make peace with the hyenas, the vulture has every incentive to shut that shit down. The vulture has every incentive to manipulate the lions into continued hatred for the hyenas. The vulture has every reason to remind them of their dead loved ones who died in the savage jaws of the hyenas. He has every reason to restoke those flames of hatred anytime they're starting to cool. It's in the vulture's best interest to keep them full of hatred and always at war. Or let's say the hyenas get it in their minds that maybe these cages aren't okay. When the hyenas start to say things like, we're supposed to be roaming free and living life. What is this cage and why are we in it? See, the vulture has every incentive to step in at that point and preach to the hyenas and say, no, this cage is the right way to run the world. This cage is how it's always been and how it always should be. This cage is proper and true. And it's out there, outside the cage, that's wrong, dear hyenas. That has all the heathens and the chaos. It's out there that has all the danger and evil, the vulture says. The vulture has every incentive to manipulate the two different tribes into continued fights and into continued death, all for the sake of the farm. See, for that vulture, motivated by its own survival, all lies are white lies. All evils are necessary evils, right? For this vulture, he's hell-bent on not the good, but the greater good, right? Of keeping the farm going. This basic logic is why the winners of a game have to manipulate the losers on some level. The same reason any farmer has to manipulate the animals on the farm. If they don't have the cages, and if the animals knew the truth that their whole job was to lose, the animals would just escape the farm and never come back. Because that's where we are right now. We are living in a system and living in a process, living in a method, a sort of ocean of policies and rules and cultural norms that we don't question. And we're told we're free. We're told everything's fine. We're told that what problems do exist, they're not up to us to fix. They're someone else's job. And we just rinse and repeat. And so we go back to work on that cotton field and we pick that cotton because it's quote unquote the right thing to do. And then we teach our kids to go get just enough education to do the same thing. And if you want to be a well-paid cotton picker, well, you better go get a well-crafted, expensive education. And then you can pick cotton, but better. You can pick cotton, but at least you'll be better compensated to do so. But you still live in that same slave master's city with the same boundaries and the same gates and the same holders of the keys to those gates. You're still on the same farm as everyone else. You just have a slightly better position on that farm. We haven't evolved as much as we think we have. We haven't changed as much as we think we have. We're still living within old manipulations that just happen to have won the battle for our minds some years ago, some decades ago, some centuries ago. And that's what's so important for us now. We have to critically think our way through time, right? We have to critically think so hard that it's practically time traveling to undo some of the conditioning that comes from the world around us, the world we were born into. But it's one of the reasons that we have to be so careful to critically think about what's being said, about what's being pushed, about what's culturally popular. We have to be wary of these things because we are not the ones in control of these things. We are not the ones benefiting from these things. We animals aren't exactly benefiting from the gates on this farm. Okay? This culture we live in as a people, and I mean the global worldwide culture, we are not the ones benefiting from it. And this culture we live in is shaped and molded like clay in someone else's hands. This is why I keep talking about being so wary of manipulations around us. Because like I said, those are just like fine wine. Those are just finely aged manipulations, right? They were just sitting in a barrel, fermenting for a couple of centuries, and now we think it's normal. But it's not normal for there to be this orchard of apples and a gate around that orchard and one person holding the key. So if you got 1 billion apples inside that orchard and one person holds the key, and now 20 people outside that gate starve. 20 people answer to the one person with the key, and that one person gets to say, hey, if you don't do as I say, you don't get in and you starve. And hey, once you do what I say, that's only going to earn you one trip, one day in this apple orchard to eat what you can and then get the fuck back out. And then you got to do what I say again to get back in. It's a subscription model. That's not normal, but we think it is. Or rather, what I said earlier, it's not natural, despite having been normalized. All we have to do is a little bit of critical thinking to see that something is amiss. This person who has all the resources we need to survive, locked behind a gate, and we have to subscribe monthly to survive, monthly and even daily servitude that we call work, just to survive. All we have to do is a little bit of critical thinking to see that something is amiss. Something is wrong with that setup of society, with that structure of society. But no, seriously, you guys, we're free. We're free, you guys. When we pick cotton, when we clock in and go to work, it's just the right thing to do. Come on now. When you're inside of a zero-sum game, functioning on a zero-sum logic, you have to manipulate the losers of the game into continued losing. You have to farm their losing like that vulture did. Because if the losing ever stops, so does the winning. If the ones at the bottom of a zero-sum game stop playing, then the ones at the top don't get to continue winning. And if you're mid-game while there is still points and power to be gained, you can't have your bottom falling out and dying out. You have to manipulate them into staying in the game. You require their continued participation like a pyramid scheme. Except when you hold the power and authority, you can force the bottom of that pyramid to stay in the game. You can coerce them into staying on the farm. See, for that vulture to maintain his empire over the lions and hyenas, not only does he have to farm their bodies, trying to, get their birth rates to keep up, but he also has to farm their minds. He has to cultivate and nurture their hatred for one another, or else his empire is under threat of collapse. He has to manipulate them all. In a zero-sum game where the game is rigged against the player with fewer points, the first place player has to manipulate the second place player to keep them in the game, or else they just quit. Who's going to willingly play a rigged game unless they're forced to, as our system forces us to? So to answer that earlier question, why would someone of great power, authority, and control want to manipulate those with less power, less authority, less control? Why use news outlets and media and laws to shift beliefs and cultures and actions? Why would the winners of the game have any incentive or reason to lie to and manipulate the losers of the game? Well, this vulture and the logic going on inside his head concerning its own survival is hopefully at least a clue to answer that question. Okay, the folks in our real world with the most points and the most power are also shifting entire cultures with that power. And for their own survival, they have every incentive to shift more points to themselves and more power. For their survival, they have every reason to manipulate and lie to us, lions and hyenas, to keep us all on the farm. Telling us that the cages are normal and good, telling us our conflicts are unavoidable, and they're telling us that all we have to do is struggle upwards, you guys. Get out there and fight. Fight if you really want to be out of the cage. And they say if we fight hard enough, someday we can be vultures too. And they want us to believe that our only options are either to farm or be farmed. And we have to build up an immunity to see straight through that bullshit. And before you say, but Rufus, what if they're trying to help everyone and not just themselves? What about the good people gaining power to do good? What about the charities and donations and philanthropy efforts performed by, all the good-hearted people out there, Rufus? Well, try to remember what I'm saying here. We've created a zero-sum system for ourselves on this planet. Not just one town, not just one city, not just one country or continent. It's the entire world. We've crafted a zero-sum system for ourselves on this planet. Our worldwide system operates on this zero-sum logic. So if it's not you and your neighbors losing, that just means the losing has been exported somewhere else. If you look around and everyone you see is prospering and thriving, then the losing has only been exported to some other neighborhood instead of yours, some other country instead of yours. In a zero-sum game, the losing is a hardwired, required part of the game. It's just a question of who is losing and where in the world are they. So for our entire world to win using a zero-sum system, we'd need 3 or 4 more planets. And let me be clear here, okay? I don't just mean 3 or 4 more planets. I mean, we'd need 3 or 4 more planets to lose at the zero-sum game for our planet to win at it. Okay, I'm saying we'd need 3 or 4 more planets of slaves. We'd need 3 or 4 more planets of suffering and destitution, okay, of resource depletion, all right? For our entire planet to find prosperity using a zero-sum logic, we'd need to use a few spare planets to do it, okay, folks? We'd have to strip those planets of resources and use the bodies of their people for labor. Like I said, the losing has to be exported somewhere. It's just a question of who and where it's exported to, because it's a requirement in a zero-sum game. You can't gain a point on one side without losing a point on the other. And seeing as how we aren't exactly near any other populated planets right now, we're using each other. We're stripping each other bare of resources, and we're exploiting each other for labor. We can't keep being distracted by our position within this zero-sum game, whether it's the bottom or the top or somewhere in between. As a species, we need to see the flaw in the formula itself. It has a breaking point built in, and that formula will see us all go extinct, winners and losers alike. Honestly, half the work of developing this manipulation immunity I keep talking about is just recognizing that you're in a zero-sum game and realizing how that affects incentives. So I said earlier that I wanted to talk about 2 major ways that we are manipulated. I talked mostly about one, which is, being manipulated against each other. But I want to shine a bit more light on the second major way that we're manipulated, which is against and away from solutions. If we consider the lions and the hyenas from earlier, them getting out of those giant cages would have been a solution to the problem of their captivity. Peace between the two tribes would have been a solution to the problem of war and death between them. But any true solutions available to them are also threats to the vulture and the system the vulture built around them, which is to say the vulture's empire and the economy within that empire. So for the vulture, it's critical to not only manipulate the lions and hyenas against each other, but he also has to manipulate them against solutions, the solutions that would free them from the cycle. You know, several years ago, I used to know this one coworker that had like super political beliefs and loved talking to people about politics. To be more accurate, he seemed to enjoy arguing with people who didn't share his politics. But, you know, he was the type who would like hear something on the evening news and then come to work the next day and argue with people about it. Now, I don't recall what on earth ever started me talking to this guy about the state of the world and what we could do to fix it. But at some point I did. Let's call this former coworker of mine, Mark. Okay, Mark isn't his real name, but he is a real person I knew. The basic gist of our conversations went a bit like this. Okay, after Mark would come, storming into work about whatever the news told him to be mad about, I'd ask him, what he thought the solution was to this alleged problem he was upset about. And the most he would ever suggest was that people should watch the same news he did so they wouldn't be idiots and then, vote for the same team he votes for, because clearly the team he votes for are the good guys and the smart guys, and everyone else is wrong and evil. Now, I'd listen to his angry rants about these things, but then I'd tell him things like, we need to question the origins of our problems, and we need to think outside of the box if we ever want to truly solve those problems. And I would say things like, our problems do have solutions, but the news institutions and politicians aren't going to be the ones to talk about those solutions. They're not going to be the ones to offer those solutions. Maybe you're searching for those solutions in the wrong place, Mark. Now, he would dismiss those kinds of things and he would just continue ranting, He was really stuck in a kind of loop, you know what I mean? A thought loop. Mark seemed to only see the problems he was told from these powerful news and political institutions, and even then only the surface of those alleged problems. Moreover, Mark could only offer solutions that stayed within the bounds preset by those same news and political institutions. So when I would come along, suggesting that the truth was larger in scale than what he was finding on TV, and our solutions would likely need to be much more than just tuning into the right news channel and casting the right vote, of course, his first instinct was to dismiss. See, I think Mark had been manipulated into not just dismissing me personally, but into dismissing the message itself, right? This message that there's a whole lot more to understand, more to do, and more ways to solve larger order problems. I believe that Mark, like so many of us, was manipulated into looking to our news to inform us and to our politicians to act on our behalf. So the idea is that information could come from somewhere other than the news and that meaningful actions could be taken by other people other than the politicians. It was foreign to him. To him, that info, any info received from not the news and any actions taken by not the politicians must be automatically wrong, automatically illegitimate. And so his dismissal of those ideas were automatic as well, like a reflex. And as a consequence of that manipulation, we've been subtly guided into the same automatic dismissal of anyone who suggests there's more to understand, much more than we've been told. And beyond that, I think the way we learn and the way we can change things also goes beyond what we've been told. There are more methods than we've been told, than we've been exposed to. The reason I mention Mark to you is because despite our disagreements and differences, I still managed to learn a valuable lesson from surviving my conversations with him. I learned that, sure, this automatic knee-jerk dismissal can take on many different forms. But today, I'd like to talk about Mark's specific form of dismissal. It's something I like to call the nightmare reflex. You see, Mark didn't simply dismiss the message of thinking differently. Like many people, he had a fear response to it. When I would say something to Mark like, think outside the box to solve our problems, he would respond with something along the lines of, well, thinking out of the box is a slippery slope. Before you know it, people will be trying to think outside the box that they legalize animal sex, and people thinking outside of the box will be trying to marry trees and other types of nonsense like that. Okay. When Mark would hear me say, we need permanent, nonviolent solutions to our problems, he would say something like, there's no such thing. And he'd argue that, trying to solve problems will cause more problems. Trying to be nonviolent will lead to more violence and death. Right? Everything I said to him, he felt like the opposite outcome was an inevitability. Right. I remember mentioning to him things like, ending hunger. And there's no real excuse for us to have hungry people while we waste so much food anywhere in the world. Right. There should be no one hungry with all of this food abundance. And he would say things like, well, ideas like that will lead to no one getting to eat and the whole world will end up starving. Right. Do you see the pattern? This is what I call the nightmare reflex. Right. As soon as you mention the daylight to some of these people, their first instinct is darkness. As soon as you mention freedom and what that might mean to a completely different type of society that was born and raised free, well, suddenly they imagine tyranny on reflex. See, to Mark, I think like many other people, ideas like housing everyone immediately conjures beliefs of the end of all housing, right? Everyone homeless, right? Trying to end war to someone like him makes them feel like it will make World War III happen. Anytime I spoke about the possibility of behaving differently or just thinking differently, his response was that new ways of acting and thinking were the beginning of the end of the world. The fear and the deep distrust of even thinking about things being a little better than what they already are. Not only the fear and distrust of those ideas, but actively fighting and arguing with and even hating the people who dream of a better way of the world. It's like the mind itself gets locked into a cage. Do you know what I mean? Unable to imagine or create new ways. It's like being locked in a dark room and blinded, unable to see the future or trust anything or any path that might sound different. And I think people like this, with this nightmare reflex I'm talking about, are victims and they don't even know it. Their hopes and their dreams have been surgically removed without their foreknowledge or consent. And the surgeons that did it, that removed those hopes and dreams, were the people they trusted the most. It's sad to me. This sort of dystopian reflex, this nightmare reflex I'm talking about, it's not an accident. It's not an accident that people just don't believe we could do anything except what we're doing right now. That all possible solutions that aren't what we're already trying or attempting are doomed to failure and will have the ultimate, reaction of destroying the world. It's not a coincidence. It's not a mistake. It's part of the manipulation that we're always experiencing. And these people have just fallen prey to it. The fact that we don't even believe, the fact that we're taught to be scared of literally anything and everything that's not right here, right now, this moment, this current system. We're taught to be afraid of everything else, afraid of anything else. And it's a tragedy. It's sad. And some of this stuff is just stuff we have to overcome within ourselves, right? Like I said in the last episode, right? I think it was the diary from episode 7 of this podcast. We can't expect some class to teach us, right? We can't expect to just walk into some shop and buy understanding off of a shelf, you know? Critical thinking is a solo job. You're not going to be able to just magically think outside of the box of your own culture. A culture you were born into and taught everything you know from that culture. So it's not easy to think outside that culture's box. It's manual work to overcome and outthink these things. And one of the things that we need to start realizing and outthinking is one commonality across many cultures, and that is that problems are the foundation of all jobs and economies. And the solutions to those problems, those solutions are bad for the economy. Those solutions dissolve jobs, dissolve industries, and the associated power structures within those jobs and industries and economies. We live in a problem-dependent system. That's why I bring up my former coworker, Mark, and this nightmare reflex. Right? It's not an accident that we are afraid of solutions, that we are manipulated into fearing solutions, because those solutions are bad economics. And so we get trained, we get manipulated into fearing those solutions and steering clear of those solutions. And just like a poison is threatened by an antidote, like how a virus is threatened by an antivirus, our problem-dependent system, our problem-dependent zero-sum economy is threatened by permanent solutions, okay? And we're raised not to notice that little detail about our economies. You know, imagine standing at the base of a huge tree, right? If you look up, the branches reach up to the sky and out in every direction. That tree is like the world economy. Okay. And each branch and twig are like the smaller economies and industries that exist as a part of the world economy. Well, that tree has to be planted somewhere, right? Whether you're talking about that tree as a small seed or, in the distant past, or the giant tree that it is now, that tree at every stage of its life needs soil where it could take root. Okay. And without that soil, there is no growth. There is no tree. And so we're taught to stand at the base of that tree and look up and see the world economy branching out in every direction. We're taught the beauty of that tree, and we're taught to worship the progress of its growth. But we are never taught to look down at the soil, the dirt, the problems. The main thing all of our economies are rooted in. Problems that we're essentially prohibited from solving because it would harm the tree. It would harm the economy. At the root of every job in the world is a problem being serviced and not solved. I can't say it enough, okay? Problems are where jobs, industries, and economies come from. This zero-sum, problem-dependent system won't allow us to have solutions and jobs at the same time. See, when folks gain points in this game and power along with those points, they use that power and those points to preserve everything that got them where they are. Okay? And that means they need the problems that got them there as well. They need them to remain. Not to mention, to all governments, employment is God. Okay. It's how we elect leaders. It's how we judge and measure their performance. Employment numbers and economic productivity is everything to the people in those positions, okay? As well as the everyday populace, us working folks down here at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. So we as a species literally have every reason to keep problems around because we worship the economies and the power structures that are born from those problems. And the next logical step is managing people's actions, ideas, and beliefs within that kind of system. Ideas and beliefs and concepts like being hardworking, or concepts like progress and success, or even ideas of freedom. So even as we attempt to achieve success and freedom, we end up stifling those very things since we're in a zero-sum problem-dependent system. Let's put me in that position as the vulture, right? In the same position. Let's say in some alternate timeline that, let's say waterproof phones didn't exist. Okay. Waterproof phones and water resistant phones weren't invented yet, and the world doesn't know how to do it yet. Okay. So let's say I see this problem in this alternate timeline. I see this problem of wet phones, and I recognize the business opportunity. So I start a company servicing that problem. Maybe we'll call it like Rufus's phone drying service. All right. If your phone gets wet, you send it to us, we disassemble it, we dry it out, and maybe we even repair whatever got water damaged, right? And then we send it back to you. It's a simple, honest business that I started on my own for my own survival and success. Now, let's say in this timeline that my phone drying business grows. People are loving my service and the fact that they don't have to buy a new phone every time theirs gets wet. But see, herein lies the problem. Now what happens when my company has been around for 50 years? What happens when we've become so large and there are so many phones without waterproofing that I and my company are multi-billionaires? What happens when that company's value is hundreds of billions of dollars and the stock market hinges upon our performance and continued success? And then let's say you come along, dear listener, let's say you come along in that alternate timeline and you create a smaller startup company and you invent the first waterproof phone, or perhaps your company invents the technology to permanently waterproof all phones or something, right? What happens when that technology comes along and you've come along and your company is doing your thing, but my company has more points and more power in the game? What happens when my company has become its own empire and we've been winning at the game so hard and for so long that I could buy out other smaller companies or merge with them or whatever? Oh, I hear you saying, well, Rufus, there are laws that prevent abuses like that. Well, what happens when I can buy the politicians and lobby for changes to those laws, right? I've got the points and the power to do it within the game that I'm playing. I've got the points and the power to shift and change that game around, right? Remember, winning the game gives me the power, authority, and control to change the game to whatever suits me and my interests. My company would have the power to lobby those politicians for new laws that say that waterproofing technology is dangerous and therefore not allowed in phones, right? From my position winning the game, my goal would be to stop that technology from happening, to keep my points where they are, to keep my position in the game. So despite the solution to that problem now existing, because you've invented it with your company, the solution you've invented to waterproof phones is a threat to me because I've built my empire on the problem. And so the relief this solution would provide to the world and that technology is also a threat to me. And so I would be buying your company and buying the politicians as an act of self-preservation. There we go again with that survival logic, but within a zero-sum game that gives me the points and the power to control the game. And see, now the companies and businesses that I bought out or merged with, now all the patents and the technologies that would have threatened my empire, well, those belong to me now. Now I can own and control those patents and copyrights, and they can just sit safely in a filing cabinet somewhere in one of my attorney's offices, and they won't get implemented. Those technologies will never get to the people. Yeah, it would improve the lives of people and relieve them of hardship and stress, but it would also damage the economy, damage my empire. Remember, my empire as a phone drying service would be a major chunk of the stock market. So I hear you say, now, Rufus, come on, right? People would demand the things that ease their struggles, right? And improve their quality of life. They would never stand for that sort of thing, Rufus, where someone creates a technology that would solve a problem while someone else captures it and cages it and stops it from being released. No, they wouldn't do that, Rufus. Come on. Well, let me ask you this. What happens when I buy up all the media that those people consume? What happens when I now have so many points and so much power in the game that I now own those things that influence those people and their opinions? I own the movies, I own the music, I own the news and social media. Now I can approve and deny what will and won't be shown to those people, what will and won't hit the trending charts, what will and won't be banned or shadow banned from their feeds. See, at that point in the game, I'm still playing the game, but I also have the power and control to manipulate the game and its players, right? So I just approve the messages that support my interests, and I disapprove or deny the messages that challenge my interests. I would have every incentive to behave in the way that served my bottom line, and governments and politicians would have every incentive to protect their economies as well. You're not going to find a government anywhere in the world that's going to allow themselves to be governing a people and then let some new technology come along that suddenly erases millions of jobs overnight because it solved a problem. So everyone in a power position has a reason to agree with each other and declare that this new technology is indeed dangerous and not in the public interest. See, so the quote unquote progress and the technology gets to a point where it threatens what's already been built, right? This is that antidote threatening the poison that I mentioned earlier. This is that virus being threatened by the antivirus. In our problem-dependent system, I'll say it again, in our problem-dependent system, solutions are a threat. So in this phone drying scenario, in this alternate timeline where such a business exists and becomes a big major business, a big major company and chunk of the economy, a solution has been found by you and your smaller company. But like I said, that problem is a problem I built my empire off of. It's the soil that grew my tree, okay, or my part of the tree, right? And if that problem goes away, then it dissolves my empire, but not only my empire, all of the people working for me. It dissolves a major chunk of the economy. It crashes the stock market, okay? Except with my empire's power and authority and control while we still play the game, I just use that power and authority to stop that technology. Because progress will be what I say it is, because I have the power to do that in this scenario. Progress won't be measured by the improved life experience of the people. It'll be measured by my bottom line and our place in the economy. You see the problem? Right? And there won't be a single government that won't be on my side in that scenario because their economies are rooted in the same soil. You understand? Right? Like imagine if there were a sapient poison, right? Like this conscious thinking poison that was in charge of a town. That poison would make antidotes illegal. It would make antidotes in that town prohibited, banned, because that thing would be a direct threat to itself, right? Then it gets to continue on in its own, existence. A vampire in charge of that same town would have weekly requirements of blood donations required by law. Okay. A vampire would manipulate the people by telling them that it's a moral good to donate blood. For the children. Somebody please think of the children. You see what I'm saying? And so we have problems in charge of our economies, and we have problem beneficiaries in charge of the rules of that economy, in charge of the rules of the world, in charge of the influences and the media, in charge of the messages online, in charge of everything everywhere. We have a problem dependent system and a problem dependent global economy. So the solutions, just like that town run by the vampire, okay, the solutions are outlawed and frowned upon. The solutions are propagated against as, not being in the public interest. And so the politicians get bought, laws get rewritten, companies merge, patents and technologies get consolidated, right? All to halt threats to the vulture's farm. To say nothing of the fact that the vultures employ enough workers within these economies that they hold the lion's share of the employment market too, okay? So even the regular everyday foot soldiers on the ground of the economy, working their little jobs, flipping burgers and pushing boxes in warehouses, even us folks down here at the bottom don't want our jobs to go away, job numbers to go down, employment to go down, unemployment to go up. We get taught to fear these things too, because they very directly affect our ability to survive, that survival that we have to rent every month. And so we end up in a situation where everyone consents to this corruption, this built-in corruption within the fabric of this game we're playing. What government would dare let any empire fall once it gets to that point, right? So see, then you start hearing terms like too big to fail, right? That's where shit like that comes from. Once a poison or a parasite integrates itself deep enough into a host system, that parasite becomes a need at that point. All right. And the host can't be rid of the parasite without harming itself. You know what I mean? This is the same way a cancer might become so malignant that it's inoperable. It's too deeply and thoroughly integrated into vital systems. OK, and this is how problems behave in our system. It's all malignantly permeated throughout the system to the point where we all agree and believe that it's inoperable, right? And so in this zero-sum game we're all playing, we're still playing that game by choice. Make no mistake. We don't have to function this way. We choose to. But within that zero-sum game, total domination and total permeation, total control become just another survival tactic. They become logical reasoning for survival. So this so-called progress within a zero-sum game, it's a false progress. It's not real. It has a breaking point. Just like any vulture on any farm, it has a limit. And when it nears that limit, it becomes more about stopping progress at any cost rather than to let it continue. Progress has a hard cap, a ceiling, before it becomes economically threatening. So even if company leaders publicly and openly proclaim their desire for progress, and even if the governments and politicians say the same thing, the truth will be something else entirely when it comes to money and power. And anyone can easily see through that lie by watching the movements of money and the consolidation of power. And to make it all work, for the whole farm to remain functional, the people being farmed have to be manipulated into not recognizing the farm for what it is, and into believing that they're already free, that they're as free can get, that they have already achieved the maximum level of freedom. Let's crack open this concept of freedom with another thought experiment, shall we? Okay. Since we're playing a zero-sum game with human lives on the line, the word freedom gets thrown around quite casually, I think. But we never seem to notice the cage around that word, the inherent limits of this concept of freedom within a zero-sum context. So I want to briefly dissect our use of that word. Let's suppose in yet another alternate timeline that you owned an orange grove and you grew that orange business so large that it became its own empire, right? We're talking about a lot of empires today. I wonder why. Let's say you grew to own hundreds of large orange groves around your country. And you also have orange juice factories. You have orange fragrance factories, orange food trucks, right? Let's say you've got orange ice cream and candy shops, right? You've got this entire empire built off of these oranges and these orange groves you've got spread across your country. So basically, you are your own orange industry. OK, I mean, you can think of an industry like a company of lots of companies. Right. So like basically, here's this umbrella corporation of your orange grove, and it's got all of these little, offshoot companies that have sprung up from that company. This is why I say it's basically the equivalent of you having your own sort of pseudo industry. So let's say in this scenario that, like the last one, your orange company, your orange empire is worth trillions of dollars in GDP, okay, for your country. And most jobs that exist in this country are jobs within that orange industry of yours or in some way connected to it, right? So like, for example, statistically in this alternate timeline, most people that you talk to work in some sort of orange based industry, right? They work at one of the candy shops or one of the ice cream, one of the orange ice cream shops, or maybe they work at one of the factories, or maybe they pick the oranges on one of the groves. These are most of the jobs in the job market of this alternate timeline where you own this orange industry, where you sit at the top of this orange empire. Now, what are your opinions going to be when people start talking about growing their own orange trees in their front yard? Maybe the people want freedom from your orange grove, from the orange prices you charge. Maybe they want freedom from the jobs in the factories. And they figure, let's start growing our own orange trees in our front yards, so we could be free. How are you going to feel about that, right? Maybe they want to construct, automated vertical farms, near every neighborhood that just keeps spitting out automatic oranges. Right. So if those oranges coming out of that vertical farm are free, are you going to let that happen? Are you going to be okay with that kind of freedom for the people? Sure, it frees them from their jobs. It frees them from the costs and expenses of having to buy their own oranges. It frees them from your authority because they can just grow their own and pick them themselves and do whatever they want with it. That's freedom to them. But is that what you would agree is something that should happen? Something that would utterly topple your entire orange empire? How are you going to react? My guess is the first thing you're going to say is no. You're going to say that's not freedom. That's not what the future should be. That's not what people should want or what people should do. And you're going to have enough money and power with trillions of dollars worth of GDP, depending on your company's success, your company's continued progress. So you're going to end up with politicians in your pocket and laws on your side. And you're going to have a fleet of lobbyists just in case the laws stop being on your side, in case people, push too hard and start threatening those numbers, threatening that GDP, threatening your empire. Right? You're going to do everything you can to push that this idea that people have of growing their own orange trees in their front yards is a bad idea. You'd say to the people, oh, you want freedom? You're already free. Work is freedom. Freedom is work, you'd say. Freedom is when you work in these orange factories. Freedom is when you climb up the corporate ladder in one of these orange companies. That's freedom. And once you get powerful in one of my orange companies and you're getting this giant fat salary, that's wealth. That's freedom. What kind of freedom are you really going to be about when people come along with crazy ideas like planting their own orange seeds in their own yards and growing their own trees? What's going to be your opinion when everything you've built depends on them depending on your orange trees and your orange factories? You'd likely tell the people that, that's tyranny. Right? Some lifeless automated system to control their orange supply in those vertical farms. Oh, that's tyranny. Even as you literally control their orange supply with the way things currently are. So you'd have every incentive to preach to the people that it's bad for the economy, right? All you got to do is frighten the people with the fact that they'll lose their jobs if the orange factories and orange groves get decommissioned. And it'll work because these people who are out there working at your orange factories are also motivated by their own survival. And so it works to frighten them about losing their job, which is, of course, a threat to their ability to survive. Right? All you got to do is pay a bunch of pundits a lot of money to hop on television and news networks and remind the people about the job market, about mass unemployment, about the struggle, show them images of the homeless, frighten the people into keeping things the way they are, into staying in your orange companies as part of your orange empire. All you got to do is remind the people that your orange industry holds a large piece of their economy, the economy they depend on, that you and your orange companies are too big to fail. That's all you got to do. Just remind the people that if you go under, they go under. And it's simple to manipulate people away from solutions. All you got to do is frighten them about how badly they need the problem to stay around. See, people planting their own seeds would be a solution to lots of different problems. The problem of coerced labor, the problem of not having their own supply, their own authority, the problem of the costs and expenses of somebody else's oranges. It would solve a lot of problems to just plant their own seeds. And so those problems being solved would directly threaten your empire, built on the fact that other people don't have access to oranges unless they go through you, right? All you have to do is everything you possibly can to disseminate the idea that there is no higher level of freedom than becoming a supervisor in one of your orange companies and earning a big salary. No higher freedom than becoming an orange franchisee and controlling a slice of this orange industry, right? Just manipulate the people by telling them there are no higher freedoms than maybe owning shares in the orange companies in the stock market. That way they could retire early and let other people do all the work for them. That's financial freedom, right? That's the only kind of freedom, right? Just tell people there is no higher freedom than that. Why would you tell them this? Well, because if they keep looking for a higher freedom than that, it's going to remove from you the money, the influence, and the power that orange empire provides. It's going to take away everything that people within that company or industry have gained and worked for in their lifetimes. So they tell people there is no higher level of freedom than the one you can find within the current company, within the current industry. And we do the same thing. We tell people there is no higher freedom than the one you can find within the current system. Find your place within this orange empire. Find your freedom somewhere within the systems that already exist. Because there is no higher freedom, we're told. We get this messaging from both our corporate and political leadership. We hear the same general message from the private and public sector when it comes to the progress we're allowed to make, when it comes to what progress looks like, and when it comes to how high we should aim when we aim for our own freedom. And off we go, working hard, toiling away within the system, trying to be successful as others have defined that word. But we're working and toiling under a false ceiling with a fake sky painted on it. And we're told that we're already outside. We're told we're already free. And we've been hearing it all our lives. And so have our parents and grandparents. So we end up believing it too. Of course, it's a lie. It's not true. It's just manipulation. But it's an incredibly effective manipulation coming directly from the powerful, right? If you're the government or the political leadership over that booming orange economy and all or most jobs depend on it, how would you publicly define things like freedom and prosperity to all the workers and employees toiling away? Are you going to push ideas of less work in that orange factory and all those orange companies within that orange industry? Are you going to tell people it's a good idea to plant their own trees and get those vertical farms going and spitting out automatic free oranges? I don't think so. That government and those political leaders are going to tell the people the same thing that the corporate leaders are going to tell them. That working is freedom. That hard work leads to more freedom. And they're going to tell them that if they want more than that and they're willing to prove themselves worthy, then they should just climb that corporate ladder, buy into those stocks, own an orange franchise or two. It's the same message, asking the people to only aim so high if they want freedom. Don't hate the orange game, they say, just work harder to own a slice of it. That's true freedom. Never mind that the paint on that ceiling is beginning to bubble and peel. Never mind the rust showing through in the sky. You're already outside. This is the freest freedom possible, they say. And it's going to be up to us as individuals to develop that immunity so that we can tell the difference between a real freedom and a fake one. See, freedom as defined by the vulture is never going to be true freedom, is it? If the lions and hyenas had true freedom, the vulture wouldn't have a farm, and his next meal would always be uncertain. So the only freedom the vulture is going to want for them is freedom within the cage. Any freedom that he teaches or propagates to them will be freedom within the cage. And he tells them that the greatest freedom ever achieved in all the histories of their kind was freedom within the cage. The vulture would want all of their hopes and dreams to stop right at the walls of that cage. He would want them to dream no further. The vulture would preach that they should be good and be successful and be strong within the cage and no further. So whether it's you at the top of this orange industry or whether it's the government and political leaders overseeing the economy, anyone in power who got that power from or maintains that power because of those oranges are going to say the same thing. They're going to say that true freedom and true prosperity can only be found within the current game that we are currently playing. Freedom only in the orange industry and no further. Be strong and successful in the orange industry, but dream no further. And honestly, they might even truly believe their own bullshit. But that doesn't change the fact that it's bullshit. It's just your basic run-of-the-mill bias. And these are the folks in charge of the game we play. Even as they play alongside us, these are the folks telling us what freedom is. They're not going to push the idea that something is wrong with the game we play when they're the ones winning at that game. They're not going to want us walking out of or thinking out of our cages while the farm is still functional and economies are still booming. What winner is going to tell you that something is broken about that game? The last person to see that a game is flawed is going to be the one winning that game. Right? You ever notice, like in sports games and shit, whenever a referee makes a bad call, it's always the losing team that sees it's a bad call. It's the team that the bad call doesn't benefit that sees that it's a bad call, right? But then the team that the bad call helps, the team that the bad call assists, that team is usually the last one to see it or the last one to admit it, right? Even when all 50 slow motion cameras agree that it was a bad call, the team that bad call helps is usually the team saying, nope, it was a good call. I don't know what you're talking about. I think that bias is just something we have to contend with, that bias where we don't really see or easily see the flaws in the thing that benefits us. Right. I'm not going to dig too deep into it now, but I think there's a sort of side effect of winning, right? This kind of blindness. And I don't think we talk about that blindness enough, but I'll leave that for a future episode. Now, I recognize in these talks that the people in power come up a lot. Right. I talk about people in power. It's folks at the top, this and upper class, that. It's pretty common for myself and I think a lot of other people to drone on and on about people in a power advantaged position within this corrupt game. And I'm aware that sometimes it could even sound borderline conspiratorial. But I want to try to be clear. When I mention the control and manipulation coming from powerful people, I'm not talking about some secret order operating out of some basement somewhere while they wear dark hoods and chant over candlelight or some shit. All right. Our story on this planet certainly does have its villains, okay, and its villainy, and they do harm other people with their villainy, okay? But these people are human beings, all right? And all of us pass away eventually. But the system we leave behind keeps churning out new villains. And we never seem to question where they're coming from, right? We obsess over acts of villainy and the villains themselves, but we never ask what makes a villain. What was the context and the path taken of someone who started out as an infant like everyone else, but they ended up a villain where others did not? What makes a villain? Right? If you ever read comic books or watched superhero movies, you ever notice that both the superheroes and the villains have origin stories? The thing about the superheroes and the villains in the comics and the movies, both of them usually have origin stories of trauma and struggle, but it's just something happened different when it came to one turning out to be a superhero and the other one turning out to be a villain. Both have superpowers and both come from trauma, but there was a different path taken for each. And the thing about us humans is we have origin stories too. Things that mold and shape the ways that we think and the things that motivate our actions. We like to look at the origin stories of our heroes in the real world so we could praise them and emulate them, but we don't bother to look at and study the origin stories of our villains in the real world. So we can map out and avoid those things and heal those circumstances out of the world altogether. Right? If you look at 100 villains, what are the similarities in their origin stories? What if you look at 1,000 villains? What about 1,000,000? Right? What makes an abuser abuse? What makes a greedy person greedy? Is it magic? Right? Is it just somebody got, bitten by the wrong flea one day and were one day good and suddenly bad after that bite? You know what I mean? Right? What makes a killer pick up a gun and kill 20 people? And for that matter, what makes a CEO sign a document that dumps toxic sludge near a poor village and they kill 100 people with that signature on that document? Right? And I've got a bonus question for you. Who's defining the definitions that define one of those things as murder and the other thing as just business? Right? It's easy for us to spot the evil and spot the villainy when we see it on the news and in our feeds or on our phones or whatever. But what's the origin story of evil? Most of us have been trained to think evil is just magic. Poof, it just comes out of nowhere like magic, right? And when I say magic, I mean we've convinced ourselves that evil has no explanation. No pattern, no science behind it. And the villains, we're convincing ourselves those villains have no origin story. We just write it off as human nature so we can give ourselves an excuse and a license to stop asking questions, to stop thinking. We want the excuse to stop flipping the pages backwards in that comic book to see what made that villain a villain. And I think that's the primary reason we don't bother to change the things that make villains, that builds villains. The structure of the system is a zero-sum structure, and it automatically creates new villains like a factory churning out a finished product. Like we look at the world and we see two conveyor belts coming out of this machine, heroes coming out of one of those conveyor belts and, villains coming down the other conveyor belt. And we never question what's going on inside the damn machine. What software is it operating on? What code? Where is it getting its ingredients from? How is it being powered? We don't ask the right questions about the machine we're in. We just see the evil output and we think it's fucking magic. Please understand, when I bring up powerful people doing evil things with their power, I'm talking about the output of a machine, right? I mentioned the evils and manipulations of powerful people because they're the ones telling us that the machine is fine. And they're the ones hiring the forces to guard the machine so we can't change it. That's the only reason I talk about them. But those villains are not the enemy, nor are the guards they hired to protect the thing. Right? Who keeps the guards so poor that they could be bought for that job in the first place? What does the machine promise the powerful that keeps them so loyal to the machine? Yes, the villains of our story on this planet are guilty, okay? But they still come and go. It's the machine churning them out that never gets changed, never gets challenged, never gets questioned. It might change names and it might change forms, but it's always a zero-sum code inside that machine. And off we go. Whether it's the year 1825 or the year 1925, 2025, this zero-sum machine doesn't give a fuck about what century it is or what continent people are on. It sends us all to war with each other anyway, motivated by our own survival as we commit evils. And most of the time, the people doing the evil are convinced that they're the good guys fighting against evil. Usually evil is only recognizable from the outside looking in. You know what I mean? Most of the time, we're too ignorant. Because the machine puts our survival on the line, we're too ignorant to see that what we're doing is evil. So a lot of villains do evil while genuinely believing it's the right thing to do. Whether it's evils in war, whether it's evils in politics, or evils in business. Most of us are constantly in some version of a zero-sum conflict and driven by our own survival, right? And that's all it takes for us to believe any and all of our actions are justified. See, we think like that vulture thinks, just motivated by our own survival. So if you take, let's say business evils as an example, when we see a problem, we don't just see a problem. We see an untapped market. We see business opportunity. Why solve a problem when that problem can be farmed? See, there's too much money to be made and industries to make flourish from that problem. Even if you create more problems by dumping toxic waste near that poor village, it's for the greater good of the bottom line, right? It's for the economy. It's so we can lift other people out of poverty, right? See, the money saved by dumping that sludge keeps that company solvent, keeps the shareholders happy, keeps employees employed, and it keeps the economy moving, right? It's all about the greater good. Sure, there are a few casualties in that nearby village, but, this is all for that greater good. It's just what we need to do. The people are just, collateral damage as we continue to, build this prosperous economic future. So even though there might be people suffering from that problem or even dying from that problem, the farm must go on. We have crime and prison farms. We have war farms. Even hospitals are farms in some countries like my own. So even harm and death are commodities that the vulture can use and farm for his survival and the survival of his empire, of course. See, at any and all costs, we choose to take care of the farm and take care of the money. And as much as we might, want to look upward in our hierarchy of power and control and authority and get mad at, political and corporate leaders, those farms are our jobs and our businesses. Those farms are our companies and our industries, right? Because a lot of folks might look at this system and say that it's really messed up. But when you threaten their job by solving the problem their job depends on, suddenly they get really worried really quick and they capitulate. They compromise with the system. They say, hey, you can keep that problem around because it helps me pay the bills and get food. And the folks at the tops of these businesses and industries and the politicians they buy are the same ones who tell us that the problems can't be solved, right? And that we need them to service that problem, right? It's law enforcement saying that crime will never go away and you need us to constantly service this problem. Meanwhile, if anybody put the slightest bit of critical thinking into it, if they were doing their job and if they were effective, wouldn't there constantly be downward movement? Wouldn't crime be a downward trend? But that's not how it works, is it? If you were doing your job so well as law enforcement, as a law enforcement industry, as what do they call it? The prison industrial complex. If you were doing your job so well, then you'd technically be unemploying yourself, right? You'd be fighting crime so well that crime went down. And eventually you'd be doing such a good job that crime was so low that you would unemploy yourself. But you can't solve that problem, not truly and not absolutely, because if you did, you'd unemploy yourself and everyone else in your industry, right? If crime went away, if we listened to the psychologists and the sociologists and the behavioral scientists of the last 50 years, last 100 years, then crime could essentially be healed out of society and just not be a thing. Meanwhile, you'd have entire industries gone. That entire prison and crime farm would dissolve. And don't get me wrong, okay? The prison industrial complex is just one example of this. One example of this farming structure I'm talking about here, right? If we pay attention, our entire world economy follows this same problem farming structure. Okay, every industry, every company, every job. And in each case, It's mainly the farmers claiming that the farm they benefit from is the only way forward. Even as some of these people lobby and create new laws that limit any other options we might have besides them. See, they have the power and authority and control that we gave them and we continue to give them. And they use it to position themselves as the only solution available to us. I shouldn't say solution. Let's say the only option available to us. Their role of servicing a problem, but never solving it. Right? It's allegedly the best option we've ever had or ever will have. And they work very hard to convince everyone else that they are the only way forward. It's just a manipulation. And it comes from a desperate desire to survive this zero-sum game we're all inside of, right? Even the folks winning at the top of the game are motivated by the same survival as the ones losing at the bottom of the game. And so they position themselves to be needed, to be depended on, to be a societal requirement, social requirement. If you always need them, then they can always survive. The farm gets to operate, right? It's the same tactic used by like an abuser or a trafficker of their victims. You know, they have to force the victim into a dependence on them, because without that dependence, then they can't exploit them. OK, so folks in these power positions will tend to position themselves to be needed and depended upon, you know, or perceived to be needed by the people they exploit. Right? If you don't feel you need these companies and institutions, then it threatens the farm. Right? If you didn't depend on them for your survival, food, water, shelter, then a lot of farms would dissolve. If you didn't feel you needed a job, it would threaten the farm. If you didn't feel you needed companies, politicians, police, war, it would threaten those farms and all the money made on those farms. Hell, if you didn't feel you needed a money economy in general, it would threaten the entire empire. It would threaten the empire's entire farm. See, from that slave master's perspective we talked about earlier, right? He not only needs cages for the slaves to stay physically locked in, when they're not working, but he also needs their utter dependence on him, right? He's got to work tirelessly to ensure that there's no food anywhere else but his plantation, no shelter anywhere else but his plantation, right? He's got to shut off all other options besides himself. So the result of this logic is you end up waking up in a world where there is no option to live outside of market economics. No option to live in a house or apartment outside of market economics, right? No way to get food outside of market economics. We were born into this world where we want money out of politics and we can't have it. We want money out of prisons and policing, and we can't have it, right? We want money out of healthcare and people's medical needs, and we can't have it. You understand? See, the slave master that is money, the slave master that is monetary economics, has already parasitically spread into every orifice of the world. And every part of the world now depends on that slave master with no options outside of it. You understand what I'm saying? And everything that money touches operates on the same zero-sum logic that money does. That's why you can't have cops and prisons getting paid and less crime at the same time. That's why you can't have hospitals and insurance companies getting paid and have a healthier population at the same time. Okay, we're talking about zero-sum games here. All right? That's why you can't have politicians getting paid and those politicians honestly trying to solve the problems that employ them at the same time. You can't have both things in a zero-sum game. And the money flowing through everybody's pockets operates on a zero-sum logic. This is why we have to be manipulated away from the solutions that would free us and save us, right? What happens if we perfect the technology of self-driving, fully automated cars? Listen, full disclaimer, I understand this technology is not ready yet. It's still got a long way to go. But let's assume that we perfected that technology. We just put our hearts and souls into it as a species, and we perfected the technology for fully automated self-driving cars. Now, sure, that would save hundreds of thousands of human lives per year from dying in vehicular accidents. I think in the United States alone, we're, like 40,000 a year. And I wouldn't even begin to guess at the statistics worldwide of automobile deaths, right? So you'd be saving, let's say, well over 100,000 lives a year worldwide if we perfected this self-driving, fully automated car technology, right? But the car insurance industry, they wouldn't be getting paid. They would dissolve as an entire industry, not just the fat cat CEOs, but the secretaries and the janitors pushing mops, okay? Everybody, the customer service reps, everybody out of a job, because that entire industry is no longer needed when cars don't get in accidents, right? And that farm would crumble because you solved a problem that saved human lives. Right? Millions of our precious jobs will be gone. What happens to traffic police, right? Who work on that same farm with cars speeding and being problematic and dangerous. And now they got to stop the car and issue a citation, right? We don't need those traffic cops anymore. They're gone. That farm is gone. So they don't have a place to work. That industry dissolves. Who are they going to pull over when the cars are all automatically driving safely? Their jobs are gone, right? What about the revenue, right? What about the revenue being brought into states and counties and institutions from those citations, right? That money stops flowing, all because you dared to solve a problem, all because we dared to solve a problem and save human lives, right? You can think of the same thing with war. If we snapped our fingers and waved our magic wands, ended all war with the wave of that wand. Well, now you've got entire industries, economies that are built on war, built on the tanks, the bombs, the arms, built on the uniforms, the fucking medical care of these people, built on all of these things that require war. If you solve a problem, you dissolve industries that feed on that problem, which is the jobs, which is the economy. OK, meanwhile, you turn on the television or you fucking look up a news feed on your phone. And what is the God we worship? The economy. We desperately want the economy to be doing well. God, please save the economy. Meanwhile, that same economy is built on the problems we want to see fixed in the world. But we don't connect the two dots. We just think we have a job and that's what people do. People have jobs. People go to work. People get a paycheck to pay their bills, to, afford their own survival. That's just what people do, right? Those problems are separate. We could solve those, can't we? What's wrong with solving problems, saving lives, ending wars? What's wrong with that? We don't connect the two dots together. We truly don't see that our jobs and our industries and our economies are built on the very problems we want to get rid of in the world, the very things we want to see healed from the world, the very death, the very losses. This is where your job comes from. Whoever you are, your job comes from a problem that we cannot solve or your job goes away. And see, this is what I meant by that paint on the wall that's painted to look like a sky. And we're told we're already outside. We're told we're free. This is what I meant by that. It's an axiomatic truth of the world, a self-evident, logical truth of reality that people have jobs. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that we are on this farm and we are in a system as the cattle in that system, as the chickens and the eggs and the pigs on that farm. And we don't understand what the farm is really for, what the farm is really doing, what it's really about. We know to be mad at villainy when we see it. We know to be mad at evil when we see it, but we don't understand where it comes from. And here we are wanting two completely opposing things out of the future. OK, we want economic prosperity and economic stability, and we want to personally economically prosper But we don't understand what that means because we simultaneously want to see problems getting solved. We want to see politicians doing their jobs, at least as what we've been described their jobs are. We want to see the world get better and the world improve. We want to see a better world left behind for our children than what we were born into. We don't understand that those two things are completely opposed to each other, perfectly opposed. It's a zero-sum game and you can't have both at once, right? But we were also taught and trained and manipulated culturally to believe that this is the best we could ever do, that this is the proper way the world should ever work and ever will work. And so it's like not even questioned that all of us are out here laboring away at jobs. And those jobs are based on the very problems and things that are harming us as a people, as a species. And we're going to have to make a choice. Okay. See, if you, dear listener, dare to solve a problem, you'd better be prepared for the farmers of that problem to significantly push back, to significantly manipulate you and the public into not solving the problem you are trying to solve. Yeah, you might be saving lives and perfecting some technology. Good for you. But what about our precious, precious money? What about our holy, holy economy? See, I hate to break it to you, but truly solving problems and saving lives will always be bad for the economy. A booming economy and problem solving will never mix in a zero-sum game. Do you understand? No matter what we're being told. Because zero-sum games are anti-life. So money is anti-life. And if you think I'm wrong about that, then just act out a thought exercise of your own, right? Suppose that tomorrow you woke up with that magic wand I talked about and you solve problems with every glittery swing. Okay. Right. We already talked about war and the countless millions of jobs that would be lost from that just because you dared to save lives and bring peace to the world. Right. But let's talk about those vertical farms. Right. If you wave that magic wand and put those vertical farms on every corner and had them churning out automatic food, sure, you just, saved a bunch of children from hunger and who knows how many countless millions of lives if you got those vertical farms on every corner. But what about the economy, right? What about all the farmers markets and grocery stores? Well, out of business. If you waved that magic wand and housing became a human right and you just ended homelessness forever worldwide, big deal. You also shut down the farm and all the workers on that farm. Nobody's going to shed a tear for all the landlords that can no longer pull in, billions of dollars. But the real estate agents are also out of a job, right? If everyone has housing, then the housing prices take a steep drop, possibly going down to zero because it won't cost anything. It'll be like air, right? After that, the banks crumble. The homeowners insurance companies crumble. It's a domino effect. All right. And I'm not saying here, let me try to be clear again. I'm not trying to say that I think money should stay around, that I think economies are the right thing to prioritize. I'm just saying that we as a species don't realize that we want two contradictory things at once. We want two things at the same time that cannot coexist at the same time in a zero-sum game. And we are facing a choice as a people, as a species. We are not going to be able to continue to believe that our jobs and the economy are the top priority, and we should all just keep making sure employment's strong and economies are booming, and also be shocked and upset when everything decays and crumbles around the world, because this is what we as a people are choosing. And I think a lot of people do that. I think some of us get into this sort of highly manipulated state where we genuinely believe that we could have two opposite things at once, two opposing things at once. There are people who will argue day and night that they want a better, stronger, more booming and prosperous economy, but then they're upset that war is happening. You know, they want, you know, to see an end to homelessness, but they are excitedly selling their house for, you know, $100,000 more than they paid for it. They don't understand that these things are all connected. They don't understand that these things are one and the same. It's all within the same zero-sum game. And if it's a zero-sum game, you can't wish for the points to go up on one side of the game and the other at the same time, because it's a zero-sum game, which means that if you've got 6 points and I've got 4, you can't truly wish for me to have 5 points, because you'd also be losing a point to wish that. Do you see what I'm saying? And so in this zero-sum game, with an economy that works on a zero-sum logic, you're not going to have happy slaves and happy slave masters at the same time. Right? The scale is only going to tip in one direction at a time. The points can only go in one direction. And so I'm only trying to point out the domino effect of solving problems and the dependence that our system has on those problems, the economic dependence. So our system is broken and our system is corrupt because it needs problems to persist, and it even needs problems to grow, so that its economies can. Just like that vulture needed the lions and the hyenas populations to grow and reproduce rapidly and spread, so that the vulture's population, the vulture's empire, could grow as well, right? So the thing you're farming has to grow when you yourself are trying to grow as well. And that's just the name of the game. And so we actually end up needing more of this kind of shit, these problems, just to service this constant growth we want in the economy as well. We just don't understand, I think we don't understand that these two things are opposites. Right. So if we look at the crime situation as in this same example, right, what would be the domino effect if less crime became no crime? What if we took the steps needed to heal communities in systemic harm and truly got crime down to zero, right? What would happen? Let's think about this, right? The prisons would be all gone. Now, what about the police inside those prisons? Also gone, unemployed, right? The guards inside those prisons. Right. What about the food companies who supply the prisons with foods? Their business would dissolve as well. Right. All the slave labor that those prisoners were doing, all that cheap, free slave labor, gone out of the economy now. Our precious economy lost some slaves. Oh, no. Right. With no more so-called criminals and no more prisoners. Now we don't need so many judges, and now we don't need so many bailiffs, courthouses. Now we don't need so many attorneys. You see what I'm saying? It's a domino effect. All you did in this scenario is solve a major problem that was costing lives and causing suffering. How dare you hurt the economy like that? Right? Solving problems threatens the farm. See, we get told by the crime farmers themselves that crime is forever and we'll always need them. We get told by the war farmers that war is forever and we'll always need them. Even as they employ millions of people and make billions of dollars from those farms, we somehow believe them when they say, this is as good as it's going to get. This is all we could ever do. There is no other way, you guys. And we believe them because our own lives are on the line. And all they have to do is remind us that our jobs and our safety are at risk. And that's all it usually takes for us to support the farmers as they farm. You see what I mean? Just tug on the strings of people's survival and you can manipulate them into following you and thinking they need you. Powerful people and institutions get their power and keep their power by positioning themselves in between you and your survival. and then convincing you that you need them in order to have your survival. It's a simple formula and it fucking works. These people and institutions position themselves to be inoperable within our zero-sum system. The crime fighters and the crime enter into a symbiotic relationship where they feed each other. And then we don't want to tamper with those systems because we don't want to hurt the economies those systems support. Now, let me be super clear here, okay, about where I stand. I would prefer the saving of human lives at any and all monetary costs. All right. No amount of money can compare to the infinite value of a single human life, in my opinion. Right. Not even all the money in the world. I'm just trying to say that we're facing a choice and we have to decide what we want and who we want to be. We can't play a zero-sum game with a zero-sum logic, then put the winners of that game in charge of that game, and also expect to solve the problems that gave them their winnings in the game. We're going to have to choose to either keep suffering until the vulture's farm collapses and all of us go extinct, or to leave the vulture's farm and build a completely new system that uses a logic of life instead of death. I choose life, okay? But we as a species, we're going to have to choose. And if we choose life, we're going to have to learn to see through the bullshit that would lead us away from the solutions we need and back onto the farm where we only work towards our own extinction. We have to remember that these manipulations will always look very convincing, and powerful folks will always make a strong effort to artificially keep problems and conflicts around, because that's where their power and authority came from. You understand? There's too much invested in those problems, too much invested in that brokenness for them to have any incentive to fix it. The wars, the crime, the sickness, the homelessness, the constant political divisions, and the various other problems that employ us all. Those folks with the most influence are getting the biggest benefit from those problems. Again, it's not to blame individuals necessarily. It's to blame the structure of the system we have, right? It's the formula we're using. It's the fact that we even have a system where divisions and problems are profitable while solutions and unity are not. There's no money in permanent solutions. There's no money in unity. If you're a player in this zero-sum game and you get to make the rules in this game, you get to establish the laws within this game, you officiate this game, then the very first thing you're going to do is what's best for you and your survival, which is getting more points in the game. But those points, by definition of a zero-sum game, are coming from the losers of that game. So if you have that basic understanding that the power difference in a zero-sum game is going to incentivize differently, it pressures differently, then it's easy to understand that somebody at the very top of the game is going to want things and desire things that are bad for the people at the bottom, specifically for the people at the bottom. It doesn't take a genius to see that what's good for the slave master is bad for the slave. That's how zero-sum games work. I think this goes far beyond concepts like good and evil. This is more like survival corrupted. That's why when I talk about villains, I'm not really trying to point out this lobbyist or that one, this business owner or that one, this billionaire or that one. It's the logic itself that I'm trying to point out here. We are giving certain people incredible amounts of power, and then those people use that power to keep that power. And that's the subsequent result of the power itself and the poison of that power. And that's what I mean when I say that we here at the bottom have to have an immunity to that type of manipulation, the manipulation that comes from the way that this farm has to function and the sort of requirement that those doing the farming manipulate the farmed. Because as soon as these people obtain that power, they're going to reshape and restructure the rules of the game with that power. They're going to mold it like clay in their hands, how the game functions, how the game works. And then all of a sudden, what could have been a solution that rescued us from a problem as a people gets buried or killed as a concept or killed as a technology or patented and locked away in some filing cabinet, like I said. And why do we bury these things? Because of the people that depend on those problems, the economies that depend on those problems. All of it is under the control of and within the influence of the people who benefit from them, benefit from those problems. They're the beneficiaries of that corruption. So we end up basically in a system that perfectly mirrors what those in the most power and who have the most influence want it to be. And it's us down here at the bottom who need to do a better job seeing through that illusion, seeing through that delusion, seeing through it all so we know what we ultimately want and what's ultimately best for us all, right? Because at the end of the day, if we want a better world that's all about solving problems, then we can't have that world while our current one is problem dependent. And we have to do a better job of not taking people who service problems and people who gain their power and authority from problems. We can't put those people in charge. That doesn't make any sense. OK, because they get in control of all the rules and the laws and all aspects of the game. And then we're the ones who are shocked when the game doesn't change. We're the ones who are shocked when the various corruptions we see and experience never go away. We're shocked when it's a new generation of corrupt people in power, and they're just as corrupt as the last generation. We just write that off as human nature when we see it. And then we keep trying to shove the good guys in power instead of the bad guys. We've got to do better, right? Because then those so-called good guys guide us away from the solutions all the same. And we believe them because they're allegedly the good guys. I'm saying that if we're not careful, if we don't learn to see through the bullshit of good guys handling power differently than bad guys, then we're going to keep being distracted from what the zero-sum game is doing to us all. And we're not going to be able to recognize the solutions when they come. Because the so-called good guys and the bad guys both agree that those solutions would be bad for the economy. OK, and we'll be easily led against each other and led away from those solutions just because the TV and the YouTubers and the social media feeds say so. This is what happens when you structure society in that way. OK, in a way that, those who win the biggest or benefit the most from all the chaos are also the ones we put in charge. We give them the steering wheel of the car and we beg them to drive us to a better world. Oh, Mr. Entrepreneur, sir, I see you've spotted a problem, a business opportunity and started a business. Oh, I see you've built that small business into a big one and grown that big business into a big company. Well, I guess we should all listen to you when you say that the problem your company is servicing can never truly be solved. Yes, that problem that your company is making billions by servicing can never be gotten rid of. Sure, seems totally legit. Right. And that's just the fucking private sector. Right. Because in the public sector, we do the same shit. Oh, hi there, madam. I see you're running for public office. I hear you're going to keep employment up and keep industries booming. Right. Well, you've gotten my vote. You should definitely be in charge, ma'am. Surely you'll solve these problems. Yes, that very problem, the very same problems that our jobs and economies depend on to exist. The very problems that give your position in public office a reason to exist. Sure, seems legit. You have my vote. See, I don't think we understand what we're doing, okay? How can anyone truly solve problems in the public or private sector when industries require those problems in order for those industries to exist, in order for our jobs to exist? Permanently solving problems will permanently dissolve economies, okay? To say nothing of the fact that the people we put in charge get their money, their power, and their authority from those problems. So whether it's for selfless reasons or selfish ones, either way, none of these people have any incentive to see problems permanently solved. And they have every incentive to keep us and our biggest problems on the farm, constantly producing, constantly losing to create the winning. So we end up as a society having to milk our problems like a farmer milks a cow, okay? And in order to keep problems around, we have to be made to believe. We have to be convinced. And we are all successfully convinced that the imaginary lines are real, that the problems can't be permanently solved, that endless work for work's sake is a righteous and holy calling, and that everything we're doing is all just human nature, and that there is no other way. We are all convinced. We here at the bottom of this zero-sum game never question the idea of playing a game with winners and losers. And subsequently, we don't question the idea of letting the winners lead. Never mind the fact that the winning we worship literally costs losing. Okay? There's no point a winner can gain in that game that doesn't come from the loser's loss. So when we want to see continued winning, we are unwittingly asking to see continued losing. When we reward winners for winning, we are also rewarding them for the losing they've caused along the way. When we prop up the winners to lead us to more victories and more progress, we are also asking for their farm of losing to grow. Like, for example, if you need a gallon of milk, you need a cow, right? If you need a truckload of gallons and gallons of milk, you need a farm of cows. And if you want your milk business to grow so large that it has truckloads and truckloads of milk, each with countless gallons, then you're going to need a lot of cows. You're going to need a lot of cows. All right. The bigger you want your milk empire, the more cows you'll need making milk. OK, that's the more space you'll need to feed all of those cows, and the more food you'll need to feed them. The more milk you want to gain, the more resources will have to be fed into your farm to do it. I'll say it 1,000 times. Okay. In a zero-sum game, the gains only come from losses. They're not magic. So for the winners of our society to win in this zero-sum game, those winners need their own lost farms to gain from, to win from. And when we then beg for the winners to grow, right? Grow themselves, grow their companies, grow their economies. We are unwittingly begging for those lost farms to grow as well. And just like that milk farm that has to grow for that milk business to grow, a bigger and bigger lost farm is required for us to progress forward within a zero-sum system. The points have to come from somewhere. What I think we don't understand as a species is that winning isn't magic. It comes from somewhere, right? In a zero-sum game, the points and the power have to be extracted from somewhere. Just like those cows, the winning is hungry and has to be fed, right? The chickens need chicken feed on that farm. The horses need hay. The winning needs losing to consume for it to grow, okay? It's hungry to be fed. Within a zero-sum game, the winning is fed by the losing, okay? It requires it. And the more winning you want, you're going to need a farm of losing in order to feed it. And I don't think we get it. I don't think we understand. We go and reward the winners with more power, more authority, and control. We beg the winners to lead us all to more winning and victory. Meanwhile, we're still within a zero-sum game, functioning on a zero-sum logic. So those winners we put in charge and listen to can only get that winning we crave from one place: us. They get it from us. We are the animals on that farm, trading our bodies, our time, and our lives to produce the milk and the eggs and the meat for the farmers that own us. But we are told we are already free, and this is the proper way of the world. We're told that more winning and more winners is a good thing, and we're told that that's called progress. But progress using a zero-sum logic is a false progress. It's not real. The points of the game are not infinite. They can only be traded from loser to winner in a zero-sum game. They don't come out of a magic portal in the sky. So it's not real progress. It's just extraction. It's taking points and power from the loser in order to create the winner. A zero-sum game can only work by extraction. But you'd never know it from what the winners advertise about the game we're all playing. From what the winners tell us, there's nothing wrong with the game they're winning. The way they tell it, all their victories and winnings come from hard work and their inherent worthiness, right? And all the losing of others is completely unrelated to their winnings. The losing is just what the losers are doing to themselves because they apparently aren't worthy enough. These winners of our system push a message that says there are infinite points in this finite world. And if you don't have enough to survive, it must just be your fault, right? If they have 1 billion more points than you, 20 more houses than you, 50 more cars, well, that must just come from them putting in billions of times more work than you and just being inherently more worthy than you. Listen, if everything the cows and horses and chickens and pigs on a farm ever know are taught to them by the farmer that eats them, then they'll never know the truth of the farm, will they? They'll think they're free right up until the slaughter. It's the farmers that tell us cattle that the farm is a place of progress, of prosperity and plenty. It's those farmers who become the most powerful and most influential, who become the most capable of spreading their ideas and their opinions to the widest audience and having that contagion catch. It's not just about thought contagions and idea contagions. It's also about the rules and the rules that the most powerful people get to create and enforce. When beliefs aren't enough to control a culture or a population, just change the rules. Just create new laws and enforce them. Maybe rewrite a law that makes it easier and more legal to pay off politicians. And make another law to keep corrupt judges seated for life, no matter how much corruption they're guilty of. Throw in a couple of copyright laws to control the arts and keep all that money headed upward to the top. Maybe shift a few laws to make it easier to shit on employees in the workplace, right? A few shittier workplace conditions here, longer work hours there, lower safety standards here and there. I mean, it saves the company money after all, right? Rewrite a few regulations, let lower quality ingredients and higher toxin levels get into the food, right? It saves the company money, anything to save the company money. Fewer rules means a richer economy, right? Right. And just to round things off, when your employees are getting all pissed off and frustrated, make some more laws to, make it harder for them to strike, make it harder for them to have a voice, even as everything decays around them. And while you're at it, get that new technology bought out, the one that's threatening your business, patent that bad boy and store it away in a filing cabinet somewhere. See, this is why I keep bringing up the rules, because the rules are very powerful. The rules that we're intended to follow. It plays a very important role on a farm. Like I said, can't have a good farm without strong gates, right? If antitrust laws get in your way, just rewrite those laws too. I mean, it's easy. Whatever it takes to keep the machine running smoothly, right? Whatever it takes to keep the farm producing. Again, as villainous as these people could be, they're just copies of the ones who came before them, as are we. Okay? All of us are just reading from the same script that comes with our role in this zero-sum play. And it's all rooted in survival. Okay? It's survival corrupted by a zero-sum game that bundles an increase in power in with the point system, in with the reward system. And it leads to the same problems with us as it did with that vulture. And ultimately, it'll arrive at the same outcome all zero-sum games do. It'll end. It doesn't matter what time period you're looking at. It doesn't matter what economic ism you believe in. All zero-sum games have the same outcome. They end. The individual villains, they come and they go. But the zero-sum game reigns over all eras, all continents, all economic isms and timelines. I think we just keep repeating the same mistake each time. We're born into the zero-sum game and raised to believe that it's the only way to live. We're taught that since it's been going on for thousands of years before we were born, then it must necessarily continue now and for thousands more years, right? And at some point, as we are growing up, we're all convinced to fall in line, right? Get out there and get yours. Dog eat dog, kill or be killed. We play our part, we work our jobs, we vote, and we pass the game on to our children before we pass away. We convince our children of the same imaginary lines, the same false freedom, and then we leave them to continue the fight within the zero-sum game. We teach them to blame the so-called villains of the zero-sum game, and we teach them to spend their lives focused on fixing those villains in order to fix the problems. Meanwhile, we're blind to where new villains keep coming from. We've got to understand the zero-sum logic of the game that we're inside of, the logic that it puts in the minds of the winners, right? And the subsequent actions those winners will take within a zero-sum logic. And we've got to be wise enough to understand that, power, if anything, disqualifies you from control, not grants you, not qualifies you for control. Okay. If anything, it disqualifies you. And yet we've got to learn. This puts us at a serious disadvantage when it comes to the world we're born into, right? Having certain cultural norms take hold, having certain laws and rules and policies become commonplace, right? Because the people who got all the power and the people who have all the control and authority and the people who are dependent upon all of the problems that the people at the bottom of this zero-sum game are suffering, those are the people who are making every rule, every law, every policy, and they're all meant to serve continued winning. And so to put these people in charge of those things, it puts us at a significant disadvantage when we're born into their world, working and functioning their way. And so the manipulation is a necessary part of their formula to keep the farm going. Right? It puts us in a disadvantaged position when it comes to our perception of how the world should be, right? It skews our definition of how we think things are supposed to be in this world. Just like I said earlier, with people thinking jobs are a self-evident axiomatic truth of the world. And so we have to build up that manipulation immunity, and we have to critically think our way out of the systems that we were born into, because those systems are going to be positioned in such a way that they're pervasive and widespread and normalized and hegemonized. We're manipulated into not believing in solutions because of the benefits of farming the problems. And so we end up stuck in this nasty cycle, one that will ultimately lead to our extinction if we don't break out of the zero-sum game we've trapped ourselves in. That's why I keep saying we have to critically think our way out of this thing we were born into, because everyone who taught us how the world is and how the world should be, we're wrong. Our parents were certainly wrong, and our grandparents were certainly wrong. The question is figuring out and sorting through and discovering exactly where. Because as much as we want to point the finger at the villains and blame them for the world being broken, this system keeps churning out new villains and replacing the old ones as time marches on. As much as people want to blame this ism or that one for the world being broken, every system we've ever come up with has still had a zero-sum logic at the heart of it. Listen, as bad as capitalism is, did poverty start with capitalism? What about hunger, homelessness, war? Did they not exist before capitalism? Listen, I hate capitalism too. Okay. It is a blight upon the world, and it is a fast track to extinction. I believe that. But this thing we fight as a species, this thing that I stand against, is the thing churning out homelessness, churning out war, churning out corrupt, powerful people, churning out hunger and starvation. Okay. And I've got to admit to myself that as much as I hate capitalism, capitalism is not where these things started. This thing we fight has had many different names throughout human history. The name might change, okay, but the outcome is always the same. I'm suggesting that there is more we are missing. Something that gave birth to what we call capitalism and every other ism we've ever developed. What if it's not about hating the player or the game? Right? Because no player and no game lasts forever, right? What if it's about hating the formula? What if it's about learning to hate the zero-sum formula that built this game and every other game we've tried to play as a species? I think we waste so much time and energy mad at the villains. But like I said, they are on the same stage, reading from the same script. In a zero-sum play, we never question. The winners play out their role and the losers play out theirs. We might complain and protest about what role we're cast in the play, but we never seem to question the play itself and why. We've seen this same play acted out on different continents, in different languages, across different centuries. It's the same zero-sum play. A rose by any other name. Think of it like a mad scientist with this sort of petri dish full of monster DNA, right? Now, from this DNA, the mad scientist could grow a big dog monster, if he wanted to, or he could grow a big, feline monster or a giant bird monster from this DNA. But no matter what monster, no matter what shape the monster takes, or what the DNA grows into, it's still the same DNA. Each monster that grows from it, it's built on the same code, the same formula. It might look different. It might roar differently. It might bite differently, but it's made from the same stuff, the same code. That's how I see all these different isms we keep creating as a species. That zero-sum logic is our core formula. It's the DNA of our systems, all of them. Maybe we grow capitalism from that zero-sum DNA. Maybe we grow fascism from it. Maybe we look into history and, we grew feudalism from it or mercantilism from that DNA. But it's the same zero-sum DNA. It's the same monster, just in different forms. And from that same formula, each ism, each era has its own villains, has its proponents and its opponents, right? Each ism has its homeless and its starving on one side of the zero-sum game and its royalty and its rulers on the other side of the game. And in all of those isms, those people, no matter what side of the zero-sum game they were on, no matter which role in the play that they were playing while they were alive, in all of those isms, the people, the players came, they lived, and they died. And before they left, they passed that zero-sum formula on to us. And they assured us that there was no other way to live, no better way to survive. Like I said, what's the point of spending your time hating the player or the game when they both come and go? What if, call me crazy, what if it's about seeing through to the formula that it's all built from? Each time it's built, about seeing the monster DNA in that petri dish for what it is. No matter what form it takes, no matter how many different forms it might grow into, the zero-sum DNA in that fucking petri dish is death. It's an ending. Okay, it's extinction in that petri dish. Because that's where all zero-sum games lead. And if we grow anything from that zero-sum DNA, it can only offer suffering, death, and eventual extinction. If we can crack the genome of that DNA and decode that formula, maybe we can have the wisdom to stop trying to grow systems from it. Okay, to switch formulas altogether. Maybe we could develop the wisdom to use a completely different code to build a better world and thrive within it. Coming to understand that DNA, that formula, is the manipulation immunity I'm talking about. This zero-sum game we play makes the behaviors and the words of the people within it highly predictable. And it makes the lies very transparent. I think after that, we can have a much easier time seeing through the bullshit and understanding those influences and manipulations before they even reach us. I think that's when we could start to get the real work done. Because right now, we have a real opportunity for real freedom where we don't actually have to depend on others to get our needs met. But we are being told that that's tyranny. We're being told by the most powerful motherfuckers that we currently depend on for food, water, and shelter, that automating this whole fucking thing we're doing on Earth is somehow tyranny and a loss of freedom. We've got to get mentally strong enough and wise enough to see that that's just a lie coming from the most powerful people who got their power from our dependence on them and are not going to be too excited about giving that up. They're going to manipulate because structurally they have to in order to keep the game going, in order to keep the farm producing. It's a built-in part of the formula. They've got to convince people that solutions are bad and keep people busy toiling away, struggling for their own survival, instead of solving the problems that the game depends on. Keep people busy hating and killing each other instead of building a completely different system, a non-zero-sum system, the fundamental opposite formula of the one we've been using. See, this is why I say it's so vital for us to put in the personal work. To erase those imaginary lines that we've been raised to believe are real. Because when we're divided against each other, it affects the way our minds craft solutions, right? When we think and dream, we figure out new solutions and we craft them to benefit our tribe only. And if there's any losses or any suffering that has to come from that so-called solution, we just offset or export that suffering somewhere else, to some other tribe. But when we free ourselves of those imaginary lines, when we see life on this planet as the one town it's always been, we start to think of solutions differently. I think, the pressure cookers of our minds start to cook a completely different meal by a completely different recipe. We start thinking of and creating solutions that are about and for everyone. They could be peaceful, nonviolent solutions that leave no one out of the benefits. When we remove those imaginary lines, it reshapes and redefines what we think a solution even is. This is the kind of thinking that is much more challenging than thinking of only one tribe in one place at one time. This is the kind of thinking where you ask yourself to build a solution for every tribe, everywhere, and even into the future. It's not an easy or lightweight way to think at all. And so far, we've mostly failed at it as a species. But I don't believe for a second that means we'll always fail at it. We just have a code to crack. And just because that code has never been cracked before doesn't mean it never will be. Right now, cracking that code sounds like a dream that'll never come true. But let me remind you that everything we've ever accomplished as a species started as just a dream in someone's head and a belief in their heart. Everything we call progress, someone first had to dream. And now we're literally surrounded by dreams made real. It started as someone imagining, they spread those ideas, they got other people to believe, and it's in that shared belief that we start to work together and make things happen, make dreams real. Everything starts as a dream. Whether it be something as simple as a hammer or something as complicated as a television. At some point it wasn't real, and then it was. You're listening to me right now on headphones or speakers that at some point wasn't real. This technology was once an insane pipe dream that someone dreamed up, shared that dream, then worked with others to make it real. Cars started out as a dream, and then we made that dream real. What about this massive interconnected internet, right? Capable of connecting the entire world. That didn't exist until it did. Rockets, satellites, right? I could go on forever. At some point in our past, humans couldn't fly, and now we can, right? Enough people dreamed it, shared that dream, and worked on it. And now it's common for humans to fly. Now it's old news. Imagine if you time traveled to a certain point in human history and you told someone that you want to fly to the other side of the planet. They'd think you were insane. They'd commit your ass to a mental hospital or worse. Or they'd tell you something like, it's not human nature to fly. They'd tell you that it's never been done before, so it never will be done. And they'd say that because they couldn't imagine so many people dreaming up the impossible and then working on the impossible so hard that they made it possible. But of course, in this time traveling scenario, you would know better, wouldn't you? You would know that this individual who says it's impossible simply lacks information. They simply lack knowledge of the sciences that made the dream of flight into reality. So no, it's not yet common for us to live in a world with no war, no homelessness, no hunger. We don't have that world yet. But a major reason we don't have that is that the same people who could build such a world are the same people who've been manipulated into believing it's not possible. And since they believe it's not possible, why would they put in the work to build it? We have these people right now, right beside us in our times, who've had their dreams taken away. They're victims of a theft they don't even realize has happened. And they can't imagine or dream of a better world or a better system than the one they already know. See, we tell them that we dream of a world without homelessness and poverty or war, and they laugh. But they don't realize that that's the only way anything has ever become real. It had to start as a dream. Everything we accomplish starts as a dream. This is why it's so vital to develop this immunity within ourselves, because each of us are the start of everything the future holds. And embracing that fact is the first step towards shaping and molding that future with intention. It's going to take a certain kind of defiance from us. The defiance of keeping alive the dream of a better world. We have to be able to hear that a positive future is impossible, and we have to dream of it anyway. We got to be able to be ostracized for those dreams and share them anyway. Or maybe be treated like fools for planning on a utopian future and then build it anyway. That's the kind of defiant I think we need to be. All right, that's it for this episode. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.